As long as you wish. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. As Long as You Wish by John O'Keefe. The patient sat stiffly in the leather chair on the other side of the desk. Nervously, he pressed a coin into the palm of one hand. "Just start anywhere," I said, "and tell me all about it." As before? Without waiting for an answer, he continued, the coin clutched tightly in one hand. "I'm Charles J. Fisher, professor of philosophy at Research College." He looked at me quickly. "Or at least I was until recently." For a second his face was boyish. "Professor of philosophy, that is." I smiled and found I was staring at the coin in his hand. He gave it to me. On one side I read the words, "The statement on the other side of this coin is false." The patient watched me with an expressionless face. I turned over the coin. It was engraved with the words, "The statement on the other side of this coin is false." "That's not the problem," he said. "Not my problem. I had the coin made when I was an undergraduate. I enjoyed reading one side, turning it over, reading the other side, and so on. A fiendish enjoyment, like boys planning where to put the tipped-over outhouse." I looked at the patient. He was 38, single, medium build, had an M.A. and Ph.D. from an Eastern university. I knew this and more from the folder on my desk. "8 months ago," he continued, "I read about the sphere found on Paney Island." He stopped, looking at me questioningly. "Yes, I know," I said. I opened my desk drawer, took out a clipping from the newspaper, and handed it to him. "That's it." I read the clipping before putting it back in the drawer. Manila, September 24th. INS. Archaeologists from University of California have discovered in earth fault of recent quake a sphere, 2 feet in diameter, of an unidentifiable material. Dr. Carl Schwartz, head of the group, said the sphere was returned to the university for study. He declined to answer questions on the cultural origin of the sphere. "There wasn't any more in the newspapers about it," he said. "I have a friend in California who got me the photographs." He looked at me intently. "You won't believe any of this." He pressed the coin into the palm of his hand. "You won't be able to." "The photographs," he continued, as if lecturing, "were of characters projected by the sphere when placed before a focused light. The sphere was transparent, you see, embedded with dark microscopic specks. By moving the sphere a certain distance each time, there was a total projection of 360 different characters in 18 different orderings. Or 19 different orderings, if you count one, which was the list of all the characters." I made a mental note of the numbers. I felt they were significant. "As I said," he continued, "I obtained the photographs of the characters. Very strange shapes, totally unlike the characters of Oriental languages, but yet that is the closest way to describe them." He jerked forward in his chair. "Except, of course, ostensively." "Later," I said. I wanted to get through the preliminaries first. There would be time later to see the photographs. "The characters projected by the sphere," he said, "weren't like the characters of any known language." He paused dramatically. "There was reason to believe they had origin in an unknown culture, a culture more scientifically advanced than our own." "And the reasons for this supposition?" I asked. "The material of the sphere. It could only be roughly classified as ferroplastic. Totally unknown, amazing imperviousness, a synthetic material hardly the product of a former culture." "From Mars?" I said, smiling. "There were all kinds of conjectures. But, of course, the important thing was to see if the projection of characters was a message. The message, if any, would mean more than any conjecture." "You translated it?" He polished the coin on his jacket. "You won't dare believe it," he said sharply. He cleared his throat and stiffened into a more rigid posture. "It wasn't exactly a translation. You see, to us, none of the characters had designation. They were just characters." "So it was a problem of decoding?" I asked. "As it turned out, no. Decoding is dependent on knowledge of language characteristics of known languages. Decoding was tried, but without success. No, what we had to find was a key to the language." "You mean like the runestone?" "More or less. In principle, we needed a picture of a cow, and a sign of meaning indicating one of the characters. For me, there was no possibility of finding similarities between the characters and the characters of other languages. That would require tremendous linguistic knowledge and library facilities. Nor could I use the decoding approach. That would require special knowledge of techniques and access to electronic computers and other mechanical aids. No, I had to work on the assumption that the key to the sphere was implicit in the sphere. You hoped to find the key to the language in the language itself? Exactly. You know, of course, some languages do have an implicit key. For example, hieroglyphics, or picture language. The word for cow is a picture of a cow. He looked at the toes of his shoes. You won't be able to believe it. It's impossible to believe. I use the word impossible in its logical sense. In most languages, he continued, looking up from his shoes, the sound of some words themselves indicates the meaning of the word. Onomatopoetic words like bow wow and buzz. And the key to the unknown language? I asked. How did you find it? I watched him push the coin against the back of his arm, then lift it to read the backward letters pressed into his skin. He looked up at me and smiled. I built models of the characters, big material ones, exactly proportionate to the ones projected. Then, quite by accident, I viewed one of them through a glass globe the size of the original sphere. What do you think I saw? What? I noticed he had the boyish look again. A distortion of the model. But that's not what's important. The distortions, on study, gave specific visual entities, like when looking at one of those trick pictures and suddenly seeing the lion in the grass. The lines outlining the lion are there all the time. Only the observer has to view them as the outline of a lion. It was the same with the models of the characters, except the shapes that appeared were not lions or other recognizable things, but they did suggest. He pressed the coin against his forehead, closed his eyes, and appeared to be thinking deeply. Yes, impossible to believe. No one can believe it. In addition to the visual response, the distortions gave me definite feelings. Not mixtures of feelings, but one definite emotional experience. How do you mean? One character, when viewed through the globe, gave me a visual image and, at the same time, a strong feeling of light hilarity. I take it then that these distortions seem to connote meanings, rather than denote them. You might say that their meaning was conveyed through a gestalt experience on the part of the observer. Yes, each character gave a definite gestalt, but the gestalt was the same for each observer. Or at least for 35 observers, there was an 80% correlation. I whistled softly. And the translation? Doctor, what would you say if I told you the translation was unbelievable? That it couldn't be seriously entertained by any man? What if I said it would take the sanity of any man who believed it? I would say that it might well be incorrect. He took some papers from his pocket and laughed excitedly, slumping down in the chair. This is the complete translation in idiomatic English. I'm going to let you read it, but first I want you to consider a few things. He hid the papers behind the back of his chair. His face became even more boyish, almost as if he was deciding on where to put the tipped-over outhouse. Consider first, Doctor, that there was a total projection of 360 different characters, the same number as the number of degrees in a circle. Consider also that there were 18 different orderings of the characters, or 19 counting the alphabetical list. The square root of 360 would lie between 18 and 19. Yes, I said. I remembered there was something significant about the numbers, but I wasn't all sure that it was this. Consider also, he continued, that the communication was through the medium of a sphere. Moreover, keep in mind that physics accepts the path of a beam of light as its definition of a straight line. Yet the path is a curve. If extended sufficiently, it would be a circle, the section of a sphere. All right, I said. By now the patient was pounding the coin against the sole of one shoe. And, he said, keep in mind that in some sense time can be thought of as another dimension. He suddenly thrust the papers at me and sat back in the chair. I picked up the translation and began reading. The patient sat stiffly in the leather chair, on the other side of the desk. Nervously, he pressed a coin into the palm of one hand. "Just start anywhere," I said, "and tell me all about it." "As before?" Without waiting for an answer, he continued, the coin clutched tightly in one hand. "I'm Charles J. Fisher, professor of philosophy at Research College." He looked at me quickly. "Or, at least I was, until recently." For a second, his face was boyish. "Professor of philosophy, that is." I smiled and found I was staring at the coin in his hand. He gave it to me. On one side I read the words, "The statement on the other side of this coin is false." The patient watched. This is the end of As Long as You Wish by John O'Keefe.
Wub by Philip K. Dick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Greg Marguerite. Beyond Lies the Wub by Philip K. Dick. The slovenly wub might well have said, "Many men talk like philosophers and live like fools." They had almost finished with the loading. Outside stood the Optus, his arms folded, his face sunk in gloom. Captain Franco walked leisurely down the gangplank, grinning. "What's the matter?" he said. "You're getting paid for all this." The Optus said nothing. He turned away, collecting his robes. The captain put his boot on the hem of the robe. "Just a minute. Don't go off. I'm not finished." "Oh?" The Optus turned with dignity. "I am going back to the village." He looked toward the animals and birds being driven up the gangplank into the spaceship. "I must organize new hunts." Franco lit a cigarette. "Why not? You people can go out into the veldt and track it all down again, but when we run out halfway between Mars and Earth." The Optus went off, wordless. Franco joined the first mate at the bottom of the gangplank. "How's it coming?" he said. He looked at his watch. "We got a good bargain here." The mate glanced at him sourly. "How do you explain that?" "What's the matter with you? We need it more than they do." "I'll see you later, Captain." The mate threaded his way up the plank between the long-legged Martian go-birds into the ship. Franco watched him disappear. He was just starting up after him up the plank toward the port when he saw it. My God! He stood staring, his hands on his hips. Peterson was walking along the path, his face red, leading it by a string. "I'm sorry, Captain," he said, tugging at the string. Franco walked toward him. "What is it?" The wub stood sagging, its great body settling slowly. It was sitting down, its eyes half shut. A few flies buzzed about its flank and it swished its tail. It sat. There was silence. "It's a wub," Peterson said. "I got it from a native for 50 cents. He said it was a very unusual animal, very respected." "This?" Franco poked the great sloping side of the wub. "It's a pig, a huge dirty pig." "Yes, sir, it's a pig. The natives call it a wub." "A huge pig. It must weigh 400 pounds." Franco grabbed a tuft of the rough hair. The wub gasped, its eyes opened, small and moist, then its great mouth twitched. A tear rolled down the wub's cheek and splashed on the floor. "Maybe it's good to eat," Peterson said nervously. "We'll soon find out," Franco said. The wub survived the takeoff, sound asleep in the hold of the ship. When they were out in space and everything was running smoothly, Captain Franco bade his men fetch the wub upstairs so that he might perceive what manner of beast it was. The wub grunted and wheezed, squeezing up the passageway. "Come on," Jones grated, pulling at the rope. The wub twisting, rubbing its skin off on the smooth chrome walls. It burst into the anteroom, tumbling down in a heap. The men leaped up. "Good Lord," French said. "What is it?" "Peterson says it's a wub," Jones said. "It belongs to him." He kicked at the wub. The wub stood up, unsteadily, panting. "What's the matter with it?" French came over. "Is it going to be sick?" They watched. The wub rolled its eyes mournfully. It gazed around at the men. "I think it's thirsty," Peterson said. He went to get some water. French shook his head. "No wonder we had so much trouble taking off. I had to reset all my ballast calculations." Peterson came back with the water. The wub began to lap gratefully, splashing the men. Captain Franco appeared at the door. "Let's have a look at it." He advanced, squinting critically. "You got this for 50 cents?" "Yes, sir," Peterson said. "It eats almost anything. I fed it on grain, and it liked that, and then potatoes and mash and scraps from the table and milk. It seems to enjoy eating. After it eats, it lies down and goes to sleep." "I see," Captain Franco said. "Now as to its taste. That's the real question. I doubt if there's much point in fattening it up any more. It seems fat enough to me already. Where's the cook? I want him here. I want to find out." The wub stopped lapping and looked up at the captain. "Really, Captain," the wub said, "I suggest we talk of other matters." The room was silent. "What was that?" Franco said. "Just now." "The wub, sir," Peterson said. "It spoke." They all looked at the wub. "What did it say? What did it say?" "It suggested we talk about other things." Franco walked towards the wub. He went all around it, examining it from every side. Then he came back over and stood with the men. "I wonder if there's a native inside it," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe we should open it up and have a look." "Oh, goodness," the wub cried. "Is that all you people can think of, killing and cutting?" Franco clenched his fists. "Come out of there, whoever you are. Come out." Nothing stirred. The men stood together, their faces blank, staring at the wub. The wub swished its tail. It belched suddenly. "I beg your pardon," the wub said. "I don't think there's anyone in there," Jones said in a low voice. They all looked at each other. The cook came in. "You wanted me, Captain?" he said. "What's this thing?" "This is a wub," Franco said. "It's to be eaten. Will you measure it and figure out—" "I think we should have a talk," the wub said. "I'd like to discuss this with you, Captain, if I might. I can see that you and I do not agree on some basic issues." The captain took a long time to answer. The wub waited good-naturedly, licking the water from its jowls. "Come into my office," the captain said at last. He turned and walked out of the room. The wub rose and padded after him. The men watched it go out. They heard it climbing the stairs. "I wonder what the outcome will be," the cook said. "Well, I'll be in the kitchen. Let me know as soon as you hear." "Sure," Jones said. "Sure." The wub eased itself down in the corner with a sigh. "You must forgive me," it said. "I'm afraid I'm addicted to various forms of relaxation. When one is as large as I—" The captain nodded impatiently. He sat down at his desk and folded his hands. "All right," he said. "Let's get started. You're a wub, is that correct?" The wub shrugged. "I suppose so. That's what they call us. The natives, I mean. We have our own term." "And you speak English? You've been in contact with Earthmen before?" "No." "Then how do you do it?" "Speak English? Am I speaking English? I'm not conscious of speaking anything in particular. I examine your mind." "My mind?" "I studied the contents, especially the semantic warehouse, as I refer to it." "I see," the captain said. "Telepathy, of course." "We are a very old race," the wub said. "Very old and very ponderous. It is difficult for us to move around. You can appreciate that anything so slow and heavy would be at the mercy of more agile forms of life. There was no use in our relying on physical defenses. How could we win? Too heavy to run, too soft to fight, too good-natured to hunt for game. How do you live?" "Plants, vegetables. We can eat almost anything. We're very Catholic. Tolerant, eclectic, Catholic. We live and let live. That's how we've gotten along." The wub eyed the captain. "And that's why I so violently objected to this business about having me boiled. I could see the image in your mind. Most of me in the frozen food locker, some of me in the kettle, and a bit for your pet cat." "So you read minds," the captain said. "How interesting. Anything else? I mean, what else can you do along those lines?" "A few odds and ends," the wub said absently, staring around the room. "A nice apartment you have here, Captain. You keep it quite neat. I respect life forms that are tidy. Some Martian birds are quite tidy. They throw things out of their nests and sweep them—" "Indeed," the captain nodded. "But to get back to the problem." "Quite so. You spoke of dining on me. The taste, I'm told, is good. A little fatty, but tender. But how can any lasting contact be established between your people and mine if you resort to such barbaric attitudes? Eat me? Rather, you should discuss questions with me. Philosophy. The arts." The captain stood up. "Philosophy. It might interest you to know that we will be hard put to find something to eat for the next month, an unfortunate spoilage." "I know," the wub nodded, "but wouldn't it be more in accord with your principles of democracy if we all drew straws, or something along that line? After all, democracy is to protect the minority from just such infringements. Now, if each of us casts one vote." The captain walked to the door. "Nuts to you," he said. He opened the door. He opened his mouth. He stood frozen, his mouth wide, his eyes staring, his fingers still on the knob. The wub watched him. Presently it padded out of the room, edging past the captain. It went down the hall, deep in meditation. The room was quiet. "So you see," the wub said, "we have a common myth. Your mind contains many familiar myth symbols. Ishtar, Odysseus." Peterson sat silently, staring at the floor. He shifted his chair. "Go on," he said. "Please go on." "I find in your Odysseus a figure common to the mythology of most self-conscious races. As I interpret it, Odysseus wanders as an individual, aware of himself as such. This is the idea of separation from family and country, the process of individuation. But Odysseus returns to his home." Peterson looked out of the port window at the stars, endless stars burning intently on the empty universe. "Finally, he goes home. As must all creatures. The moment of separation is a temporary period, a brief journey of the soul. It begins, it ends. The wanderer returns to land and race." The door opened. The wub stopped, turning its great head. Captain Franco came into the room, the men behind him. They hesitated at the door. "Are you all right?" French said. "Do you mean me?" Peterson said, surprised. "Why me?" Franco lowered his gun. "Come over here," he said to Peterson. "Get up and come here." There was silence. "Go ahead," the wub said. "It doesn't matter." Peterson stood up. "What for?" "It's an order." Peterson walked to the door. French caught his arm. "What's going on?" Peterson wrenched loose. "What's the matter with you?" Captain Franco moved towards the wub. The wub looked up from where it lay in the corner, pressed against the wall. "It is interesting," the wub said, "that you are obsessed with the idea of eating me. I wonder why." "Get up," Franco said. "If you wish." The wub rose, grunting. "Be patient. It's difficult for me." It stood, gasping, its tongue lolling foolishly. "Shoot it now," French said. "For God's sake!" Peterson exclaimed. Jones turned to him quickly, his eyes gray with fear. "You didn't see him. Like a statue, standing there, his mouth open. If we hadn't come down, he'd still be there." "Who? The captain?" Peterson stared around. "But he's all right now." They looked at the wub, standing in the middle of the room, its great chest rising and falling. "Come on," Franco said. "Out of the way." The men pulled aside toward the door. "You are quite afraid of me, aren't you?" the wub said. "Have I done anything to you? I am against the idea of hurting. All I have done is try to protect myself. Can you expect me to rush eagerly to my death? I am a sensible being like yourselves. I was curious to see your ship, learn about you. I suggested to the native—" The gun jerked. "See," Franco said. "I thought so." The wub settled down, panting. It put its paw out, pulling its tail around it. "It is very warm," the wub said. "I understand that we are close to the jets, atomic power. You have done many wonderful things with it, technically. Apparently your scientific hierarchy is not equipped to solve more ethical—" Franco turned to the men, crowding behind him, wide-eyed, silent. "I'll do it. You can watch." French nodded. "Try to hit the brain. It's no good for eating. Don't hit the chest. If the rib cage shatters, we'll have to pick bones out." "Listen," Peterson said, licking his lips. "Has it done anything? What harm has it done? I'm asking you. And anyhow, it's still mine. You have no right to shoot it. It doesn't belong to you." Franco raised his gun. "I'm going out," Jones said. His face was white and sick. "I don't want to see it." "Me too," French said. The men straggled out, murmuring. Peterson lingered at the door. "It was talking to me about myths," he said. "It wouldn't hurt anyone." He went outside. Franco walked toward the wub. The wub looked up slowly. It swallowed. "A very foolish thing," it said. "I am sorry that you want to do it. There was a parable that your savior related." It stopped, staring at the gun. "Can you look me in the eye and do it?" the wub said. "Can you do that?" The captain gazed down. "I can look you in the eye," he said. "Back on the farm we had hogs, dirty razorback hogs. I can do it." Staring down at the wub, into the gleaming moist eyes, he pressed the trigger. The taste was excellent. They sat glumly around the table, some of them hardly eating at all. The only one who seemed to be enjoying himself was Captain Franco. "More?" he said, looking around. "More? And some wine, perhaps?" "Not me," French said. "I think I'll go back to the chart room." "Me too." Jones stood up, pushing his chair back. "I'll see you later." The captain watched them go. Some of the others excused themselves. "What do you suppose the matter is?" the captain said. He turned to Peterson. Peterson sat staring at his plate, at the potatoes, the green peas, and the thick slab of tender, warm meat. He opened his mouth. No sound came. The captain put his hand on Peterson's shoulder. "It's only organic matter now," he said. "The life essence is gone." He ate, spooning up the gravy with some bread. "I myself love to eat. It is one of the greatest things that a living creature can enjoy. Eating, resting, meditation, discussing things." Peterson nodded. 2 more men got up and went out. The captain drank some water and sighed. "Well," he said, "I must say that this was a very enjoyable meal. All the reports I had heard were quite true. The taste of wub, very fine, but I was prevented from enjoying this pleasure in times past." He dabbed at his lips with his napkin and leaned back in his chair. Peterson stared dejectedly at the table. The captain watched him intently. He leaned over. "Come, come," he said. "Cheer up. Let's discuss things." He smiled. "As I was saying before I was interrupted, the role of Odysseus in the myths." Peterson jerked up, staring. "To go on," the captain said. "Odysseus, as I understand him." End of Beyond Lies the Wub by Philip K. Dick. By H.G. Wells. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Greg Marguerite. The Crystal Egg by H.G. Wells. There was, until a year ago, a little and very grimy-looking shop near 7 Dials, over which, in weather-worn yellow lettering, the name of C. Cave, naturalist and dealer in antiquities, was inscribed. The contents of its window were curiously variegated. They comprised some elephant tusks and an imperfect set of chessmen, beads and weapons, a box of eyes, 2 skulls of tigers and 1 of human, several moth-eaten stuffed monkeys, 1 holding a lamp, an old-fashioned cabinet, a fly-blown ostrich egg or so, some fishing tackle, and an extraordinarily dirty, empty glass fish tank. There was also, at the moment the story begins, a mass of crystal, worked into the shape of an egg and brilliantly polished. And at that, 2 people who stood outside the window were looking. One of them a tall, thin clergyman, the other a black-bearded young man of dusky complexion and unobtrusive costume. The dusky young man spoke with eager gesticulation and seemed anxious for his companion to purchase the article. While they were there, Mr. Cave came into his shop, his beard still wagging with the bread and butter of his tea. When he saw these men and the object of their regard, his countenance fell. He glanced guiltily over his shoulder and softly shut the door. He was a little old man with pale face and peculiar watery blue eyes. His hair was a dirty gray, and he wore a shabby blue frock coat, an ancient silk hat, and carpet slippers very much down at heel. He remained watching the 2 men as they talked. The clergyman went deep into his trouser pocket, examined a handful of money, and showed his teeth in an agreeable smile. Mr. Cave seemed still more depressed when they came into the shop. The clergyman, without any ceremony, asked the price of the crystal egg. Mr. Cave glanced nervously toward the door leading to the parlor and said £5. The clergyman protested that the price was high to his companion as well as to Mr. Cave. It was, indeed, very much more than Mr. Cave had intended to ask when he had stocked the article, and an attempt at bargaining ensued. Mr. Cave stepped to the shop door and held it open. £5 is my price, he said, as though he wished to save himself the trouble of unprofitable discussion. As he did so, the upper portion of a woman's face appeared above the blind in the glass upper panel of the door leading into the parlor, and stared curiously at the two customers. £5 is my price, said Mr. Cave, with a quiver in his voice. The swarthy young man had so far remained a spectator, watching Cave keenly. Now he spoke. "Give him £5, he said. The clergyman glanced at him to see if he were in earnest, and when he looked at Mr. Cave again he saw that the latter's face was white. "It's a lot of money," said the clergyman, and diving into his pocket began counting his resources. He had little more than 30 shillings, and he appealed to his companion, with whom he seemed to be on terms of considerable intimacy. This gave Mr. Cave an opportunity of collecting his thoughts, and he began to explain in an agitated manner that the crystal was not, as a matter of fact, entirely free for sale. His two customers were naturally surprised at this, and inquired why he had not thought of that before he began to bargain. Mr. Cave became confused, but he stuck to his story that the crystal was not in the market that afternoon, that a probable purchaser of it had already appeared. The two, treating this as an attempt to raise the price still further, made as if they would leave the shop, but at this point the parlor door opened, and the owner of the dark fringe and the little eyes appeared. She was a coarse-featured, corpulent woman, younger and very much larger than Mr. Cave. She walked heavily, and her face was flushed. "That crystal is for sale," she said, "and £5 is a good enough price for it. I can't think what you're about, Cave, not to take the gentleman's offer." Mr. Cave, greatly perturbed by the eruption, looked angrily at her over the rims of his spectacles, and without excessive assurance asserted his right to manage his business in his own way. An altercation began. The two customers watched the scene with interest and some amusement, occasionally assisting Mrs. Cave with suggestions. Mr. Cave, hard driven, persisted in a confused and impossible story of an inquiry for the crystal that morning, and his agitation became painful. But he stuck to his point with extraordinary persistence. It was the young Oriental who ended this curious controversy. He proposed that they should call again in the course of 2 days, so as to give the alleged inquirer a fair chance. "And then we must insist," said the clergyman, £5. Mrs. Cave took it on herself to apologize for her husband, explaining that he was sometimes a little odd. And as the two customers left, the couple prepared for a free discussion of the incident in all its bearings. Mrs. Cave talked to her husband with singular directness. The poor little man, quivering with emotion, muddled himself between his stories, maintaining on the one hand that he had another customer in view, and on the other asserting that the crystal was honestly worth 10 guineas. "Why did you ask £5?" said his wife. "Do let me manage my business my own way," said Mr. Cave. Mr. Cave had living with him a stepdaughter and stepson, and at supper that night the transaction was rediscussed. None of them had a high opinion of Mr. Cave's business methods, and this action seemed a culminating folly. "It's my opinion he's refused that crystal before," said the stepson, a loose-limbed lout of 18. "But £5?" said the stepdaughter, an argumentative young woman of 26. Mr. Cave's answers were wretched. He could only mumble weak assertions that he knew his own business best. They drove him from his half-eaten supper into the shop to close it for the night, his ears aflame and tears of vexation behind his spectacles. Why had he left the crystal in the window so long? The folly of it! That was the trouble closest in his mind. For a time he could see no way of evading the sale. After supper his stepdaughter and stepson smartened themselves up and went out, and his wife retired upstairs to reflect upon the business aspects of the crystal, over a little sugar and lemon and so forth in hot water. Mr. Cave went into the shop and stayed there until late, ostensibly to make ornamental rockeries for goldfish cases, but really for a private purpose that will be better explained later. The next day Mrs. Cave found that the crystal had been removed from the window and was lying behind some second-hand books on angling. She replaced it in a conspicuous position, but she did not argue further about it, as a nervous headache disinclined her from debate. Mr. Cave was always disinclined. The day passed disagreeably. Mr. Cave was, if anything, more absent-minded than usual, and uncommonly irritable withal. In the afternoon, when his wife was taking her customary sleep, he removed the crystal from the window again. The next day Mr. Cave had to deliver a consignment of dogfish at one of the hospital schools, where they were needed for dissection. In his absence, Mrs. Cave's mind reverted to the topic of the crystal and the methods of expenditure suitable to a windfall of £5. She had already devised some very agreeable expedients, among others a dress of green silk for herself and a trip to Richmond, when a jangling of the front doorbell summoned her into the shop. The customer was an examination coach who came to complain about the non-delivery of certain frogs asked for the previous day. Mrs. Cave did not approve of this particular branch of Mr. Cave's business, and the gentleman, who had called in a somewhat aggressive mood, retired after a brief exchange of words, entirely civil so far as he was concerned. Mrs. Cave's eye then naturally turned to the window, for the sight of the crystal was an assurance of the £5 and her dreams. What was her surprise to find it gone? She went to the place behind the locker on the counter where she had discovered it the day before. It was not there, and she immediately began an eager search about the shop. When Mr. Cave returned from his business with the dogfish about 1:45 in the afternoon, he found the shop in some confusion, and his wife extremely exasperated and on her knees behind the counter, rooting among his taxidermic material. Her face came up hot and angry over the counter as the jangling bell announced his return, and she forthwith accused him of hiding it. "Hid what?" asked Mr. Cave. "The crystal." At that, Mr. Cave, apparently much surprised, rushed to the window. "Isn't it here?" he said. "Great heavens! What has become of it?" Just then Mr. Cave's stepson re-entered the shop from the inner room. He had come home a minute or so before Mr. Cave, and he was blaspheming freely. He was apprenticed to a second-hand furniture dealer down the road, but he had his meals at home, and he was naturally annoyed to find no dinner ready. But when he heard of the loss of the crystal he forgot his meal, and his anger was diverted from his mother to his stepfather. Their first idea, of course, was that he had hidden it, but Mr. Cave stoutly denied all knowledge of its fate, freely offering his bedabbed affidavit in the matter, and at last was worked up to the point of accusing first his wife and then his stepson of having taken it with a view to private sale. So began an exceedingly acrimonious and emotional discussion, which ended for Mrs. Cave in a peculiar nervous condition, midway between hysterics and amuck, and caused the stepson to be half an hour late at the furniture establishment in the afternoon. Mr. Cave took refuge from his wife's emotions in the shop. In the evening the matter was resumed, with less passion and in a judicial spirit, under the presidency of the stepdaughter. The supper passed unhappily and culminated in a painful scene. Mr. Cave gave way at last to extreme exasperation and went out, banging the front door violently. The rest of the family, having discussed him with the freedom his absence warranted, hunted the house from garret to cellar, hoping to light upon the crystal. The next day the two customers called again. They were received by Mrs. Cave almost in tears. It transpired that no one could imagine all that she had stood from Cave at various times in her married pilgrimage. She also gave a garbled account of the disappearance. The clergyman and the Oriental laughed silently at one another, and said it was very extraordinary. As Mrs. Cave seemed disposed to give them the complete history of her life, they made to leave the shop. Thereupon Mrs. Cave, still clinging to hope, asked for the clergyman's address, so that if she could get anything out of Cave she might communicate it. The address was duly given, but apparently was afterwards mislaid. Mrs. Cave can remember nothing about it. In the evening of that day the Caves seemed to have exhausted their emotions, and Mr. Cave, who had been out in the afternoon, supped in a gloomy isolation that contrasted pleasantly with the impassioned controversy of the previous days. For some time matters were very badly strained in the Cave household, but neither crystal nor customer reappeared. Now, without mincing the matter, we must admit that Mr. Cave was a liar. He knew perfectly well where that crystal was. It was in the rooms of Mr. Jacoby Wace, assistant demonstrator at St. Catherine's Hospital, Westbourne Street. It stood on the sideboard, partially covered by a black velvet cloth, and beside a decanter of American whiskey. It is from Mr. Wace, indeed, that the particulars upon which this narrative is based were derived. Cave had taken off the thing to the hospital, hidden in the dogfish sack, and there had pressed the young investigator to keep it for him. Mr. Wace was a little dubious at first. His relationship to Cave was peculiar. He had a taste for singular characters, and he had more than once invited the old man to smoke and drink in his rooms, and to unfold his rather amusing views of life in general, and of his wife in particular. Mr. Wace had encountered Mrs. Cave, too, on occasions when Mr. Cave was not at home to attend him. He knew the constant interference to which Cave was subjected, and having weighed the story judicially, he decided to give the crystal a refuge. Mr. Cave promised to explain the reasons for his remarkable affection for the crystal more fully on a later occasion, but he spoke distinctly of seeing visions therein. He called on Mr. Wace the same evening. He told a complicated story. The crystal, he said, had come into his possession with other oddments at the forced sale of another curiosity dealer's effects, and not knowing what its value might be, he had ticketed it at 10 shillings. It had hung upon his hands at that price for some months, and he was thinking of reducing the figure, when he made a singular discovery. At that time his health was very bad, and it must be borne in mind that throughout all this experience his physical condition was one of ebb, and he was in considerable distress by reason of the negligence, the positive ill treatment even, he received from his wife and stepchildren. His wife was vain, extravagant, unfeeling, and had a growing taste for private drinking. His stepdaughter was mean and overreaching, and his stepson had conceived a violent dislike for him and lost no chance of showing it. The requirements of his business pressed heavily upon him, and Mr. Wace does not think that he was altogether free from occasional intemperance. He had begun life in a comfortable position. He was a man of fair education, and he suffered for weeks at a stretch from melancholia and insomnia. Afraid to disturb his family, he would slip quietly from his wife's side when his thoughts became intolerable, and wander about the house, and about 3 o'clock one morning late in August, chance directed him into the shop. The dirty little place was impenetrably black except in one spot, where he perceived an unusual glow of light. Approaching this, he discovered it to be the crystal egg, which was standing on the corner of the counter towards the window. A thin ray smote through a crack in the shutters, impinged upon the object, and seemed as if it were to fill its entire interior. It occurred to Mr. Cave that this was not in accordance with the laws of optics as he had known them in his younger days. He could understand the rays being refracted by the crystal and coming to a focus in its interior, but this diffusion jarred with his physical conceptions. He approached the crystal nearly, peering into it and round it with a transient revival of the scientific curiosity that in his youth had determined his choice of calling. He was surprised to find the light not steady, but writhing within the substance of the egg, as though that object was a hollow sphere of some luminous vapor. In moving about to get different points of view, he suddenly found that he had come between it and the ray, and that the crystal none the less remained luminous. Greatly astonished, he lifted it out of the light ray and carried it to the darkest part of the shop. It remained bright for some 4 or 5 minutes. When it slowly faded and went out, he placed it in the thin streak of daylight, and its luminousness was almost immediately restored. So far, at least, Mr. Wace was able to verify the remarkable story of Mr. Cave. He has himself repeatedly held this crystal in a ray of light, which has had to be of less diameter than 1 millimeter. And in a perfect darkness, such as could be produced by velvet wrapping, the crystal did undoubtedly appear very faintly phosphorescent. It would seem, however, that the luminousness was of some exceptional sort, and not equally visible to all eyes, for Mr. Harbinger, whose name will be familiar to the scientific reader in conjunction with the Pasteur Institute, was quite unable to see any light whatever, and Mr. Wace's own capacity for its appreciation was out of comparison inferior to that of Mr. Cave's. Even with Mr. Cave the power varied considerably. His vision was most vivid during states of extreme weakness and fatigue. Now, from the outset, this light in the crystal exercised a curious fascination upon Mr. Cave, and it says more for his loneliness of soul than a volume of pathetic writing could do, that he told no human being of his curious observations. He seems to have been living in such an atmosphere of petty spite that to admit the existence of a pleasure would have been to risk the loss of it. He found that as the dawn advanced and the amount of diffused light increased, the crystal became to all appearance non-luminous, and for some time he was unable to see anything in it, except at night time in dark corners of the shop. But the use of an old velvet cloth, which he used as a background for a collection of minerals, occurred to him, and by doubling this and putting it over his head and hands, he was able to get a sight of the luminous movement within the crystal even in the daytime. He was very cautious lest he should be thus discovered by his wife, and he practiced this occupation only in the afternoons while she was asleep upstairs, and then circumspectly in a hollow under the counter. And one day, turning the crystal about in his hands, he saw something. It came and went like a flash, but it gave him the impression that the object had for a moment opened to him the view of a wide and spacious and strange country, and turning it about, he did, just as the light faded, see the same vision again. Now, it would be tedious and unnecessary to state all the phases of Mr. Cave's discovery from this point. Suffice that the effect was this. The crystal, being peered into at an angle of about 137 degrees from the direction of the illuminating ray, gave a clear and consistent picture of a wide and peculiar countryside. It was not dreamlike at all. It produced a definite impression of reality, and the better the light, the more real and solid it seemed. It was a moving picture. That is to say, certain objects moved in it, but slowly, in an orderly manner, like real things. And, according as the direction of the lighting and vision changed, the picture changed also. It must indeed have been like looking through an oval glass at a view, and turning the glass about to get at different aspects. Mr. Cave's statements, Mr. Wace assures me, were extremely circumstantial, and entirely free from any of that emotional quality that taints hallucinatory impressions. But it must be remembered that all the efforts of Mr. Wace to see any similar clarity in the faint opalescence of the crystal were wholly unsuccessful. Try as he would, the difference in intensity of the impressions received by the two men was very great, and it is quite conceivable that what was a view to Mr. Cave was a mere blurred nebulosity to Mr. Wace. The view, as Mr. Cave described it, was invariably of an extensive plain, and he seemed always to be looking at it from a considerable height, as if from a tower or a mast. To the east and to the west the plain was bounded at a remote distance by vast reddish cliffs, which reminded him of those he had seen in some picture, but what the picture was, Mr. Wace was unable to ascertain. These cliffs passed north and south. He could tell the points of the compass by the stars that were visible of a night, receding in an almost illimitable perspective and fading into the mists of the distance before they met. He was nearer the eastern set of cliffs. On the occasion of his first vision the sun was rising over them, and black against the sunlight and pale against their shadow appeared a multitude of soaring forms that Mr. Cave regarded as birds. A vast range of buildings spread below him. He seemed to be looking down upon them, and as they approached the blurred and refracted edge of the picture they became indistinct. There were also trees, curious in shape and in coloring, a deep mossy green and an exquisite gray, beside a wide and shining canal. And something great and brilliantly colored flew across the picture. But the first time Mr. Cave saw these pictures he saw only in flashes. His hands shook, his head moved, the vision came and went and grew foggy and indistinct, and at first he had the greatest difficulty in finding the picture again once the direction of it was lost. His next clear vision, which came about a week after the first, the interval having yielded nothing but tantalizing glimpses and some useful experience, showed him the view down the length of the valley. The view was different, but he had a curious persuasion, which his subsequent observations abundantly confirmed, that he was regarding this strange world from exactly the same spot, although he was looking in a different direction. The long facade of the great building whose roof he had looked down upon before was now receding in perspective. He recognized the roof. In the front of the facade was a terrace of massive proportions and extraordinary length, and down the middle of the terrace at certain intervals stood huge but very graceful masts, bearing small shiny objects which reflected in the setting sun. The import of these small objects did not occur to Mr. Cave until some time after, as he was describing the scene to Mr. Wace. The terrace overhung a thicket of the most luxuriant and graceful vegetation, and beyond this was a wide grassy lawn on which certain broad creatures in form like beetles, but enormously larger, reposed. Beyond this again was a richly decorated causeway of pinkish stone, and beyond that, and lined with dense red weeds, and passing up the valley exactly parallel with the distant cliffs, was a broad and mirror-like expanse of water. The air seemed full of squadrons of great birds maneuvering in stately curves, and across the river was a multitude of splendid buildings, richly colored and glittering with metallic tracery and facets, among a forest of moss-like and lichenous trees. And suddenly something flapped repeatedly across the vision, like the fluttering of a jeweled fan or the beating of a wing, and a face, or rather the upper part of a face with very large eyes, came as it were close to his own, as if on the other side of the crystal. Mr. Cave was so startled and so impressed by the absolute reality of these eyes that he drew his head back from the crystal to look behind it. He had become so absorbed in watching that he was quite surprised to find himself in the cool darkness of his little shop, with its familiar odor of methyl, mustiness, and decay. And as he blinked about him, the glowing crystal faded and went out. Such were the first general impressions of Mr. Cave. The story is curiously direct and circumstantial. From the outset, when the valley first flashed momentarily on his senses, his imagination was strangely affected, and as he began to appreciate the details of the scene he saw, his wonder rose to the point of passion. He went about his business, listless and distraught, thinking only of the time when he should be able to return to his watching. And then, a few weeks after his first sight of the valley, came the two customers, the stress and excitement of their offer, and the narrow escape of the crystal from sale, as I have already told. Now, while the thing was Mr. Cave's secret, it remained a mere wonder, a thing to creep to covertly and peep at, as a child might peep upon a forbidden garden. But Mr. Wace has, for a young scientific investigator, a particularly lucid and consecutive habit of mind. Directly the crystal and its story came to him, and he had satisfied himself by seeing the phosphorescence with his own eyes, that there really was a certain evidence for Mr. Cave's statements, he proceeded to develop the matter systematically. Mr. Cave was only too eager to come and feast his eyes on this wonderland he saw, and he came every night from 8:30 until 10:30, and sometimes, in Mr. Wace's absence, during the day. On Sunday afternoons also he came. From the outset Mr. Wace made copious notes, and it was due to his scientific method that the relation between the direction from which the initiating ray entered the crystal and the orientation of the picture were proved. And by covering the crystal in a box perforated only with a small aperture to admit the exciting ray, and by substituting black Holland for his buff blinds, he greatly improved the conditions of the observations, so that in a little while they were able to survey the valley in any direction they desired. So, having cleared the way, we may give a brief account of this visionary world within the crystal. The things were in all cases seen by Mr. Cave, and the method of working was invariably for him to watch the crystal and report what he saw, while Mr. Wace, who as a science student had learnt the trick of writing in the dark, wrote a brief note of his report. When the crystal faded, it was put into its box in the proper position, and the electric light turned on. Mr. Wace asked questions and suggested observations to clear up difficult points. Nothing, indeed, could have been less visionary and more matter of fact. The attention of Mr. Cave had been speedily directed to the bird-like creatures he had seen so abundantly present in each of his earlier visions. His first impression was soon corrected, and he considered for a time that they might represent a diurnal species of bat. Then he thought, grotesquely enough, that they might be cherubs. Their heads were round and curiously human, and it was the eyes of one of them that had so startled him on his second observation. They had broad silvery wings, not feathered, but glistening almost as brilliantly as new-killed fish, and with the same subtle play of color. And these wings were not built on the plan of bird-wing or bat, Mr. Wace learned, but supported by curved ribs radiating from the body. A sort of butterfly wing with curved ribs seemed best to express their appearance. The body was small, but fitted with two bunches of prehensile organs like long tentacles immediately under the mouth. Incredible as it appeared to Mr. Wace, the persuasion at last became irresistible that it was these creatures which owned the great quasi-human buildings and the magnificent garden that made the broad valley so splendid. and Mr. Cave perceived that the buildings with other peculiarities had no doors, but that the great circular windows which opened freely gave the creatures egress and entrance. They would alight upon their tentacles, fold their wings to a smallness almost rod-like, and hop into the interior. But among them was a multitude of smaller winged creatures, like great dragonflies and moths and flying beetles, and across the greensward brilliantly colored gigantic ground beetles crawled lazily to and fro. Moreover, on the causeways and terraces, large-headed creatures similar to the greater winged flies, but wingless, were visible, hopping busily upon their hand-like tangle of tentacles. Allusion has already been made to the glittering objects upon masts that stood upon the terrace of the nearer building. It dawned upon Mr. Cave, after regarding one of these masts very fixedly on one particularly vivid day, that the glittering object there was a crystal exactly like that into which he peered, and a still more careful scrutiny convinced him that each one in a vista of nearly 20 carried a similar object. Occasionally one of the large flying creatures would flutter up to one, and, folding its wings and coiling a number of its tentacles about the mast, would regard the crystal fixedly for a space, sometimes for as long as 15 minutes, and a series of observations made at the suggestion of Mr. Wace convinced both watchers that, so far as this visionary world was concerned, the crystal into which they peered actually stood at the summit of the endmost mast on the terrace, and that on one occasion at least, one of these inhabitants of this other world had looked into Mr. Cave's face while he was making these observations. So much for the essential facts of this very singular story. Unless we dismiss it all as the ingenious fabrication of Mr. Wace, we have to believe one of two things: either that Mr. Cave's crystal was in two worlds at once, and that while it was carried about in one it remained stationary in the other, which seems altogether absurd, or else that it had some peculiar relation of sympathy with another and exactly similar crystal in this other world, so that what was seen in the interior of the one in this world was, under suitable conditions, visible to an observer in the corresponding crystal in the other world, and vice versa. At present, indeed, we do not know of any way in which two crystals could so come en rapport, but nowadays we know enough to understand that the thing is not altogether impossible. This view of the crystals as en rapport was the supposition that occurred to Mr. Wace, and to me at least it seems extremely plausible. And where was this other world? On this also the alert intelligence of Mr. Wace speedily threw light. After sunset the sky darkened rapidly. There was a very brief twilight interval indeed, and the stars shone out. They were recognizably the same as those we see, arranged in the same constellations. Mr. Cave recognized the Bear, the Pleiades, Aldebaran, and Sirius, so that the other world must be somewhere in the solar system, and at the utmost only a few hundred millions of miles from our own. Following up this clue, Mr. Wace learned that the midnight sky was a darker blue even than our midwinter sky, and that the sun seemed a little smaller, and there were two small moons, like our moon but smaller and quite differently marked, one of which moved so rapidly that its motion was clearly visible as one regarded it. These moons were never high in the sky, but vanished as they rose. That is, every time they revolved they were eclipsed, because they were so near their primary planet. And all this answers quite completely, although Mr. Cave did not know it, to what must be the conditions of things on Mars. Indeed, it seems an exceedingly plausible conclusion that, peering into this crystal, Mr. Cave did actually see the planet Mars and its inhabitants. And if that be the case, then the evening star that shone so brilliantly in the sky of that distant vision was neither more nor less than our own familiar Earth. For a time the Martians, if they were Martians, do not seem to have known of Mr. Cave's inspection. Once or twice one would come to peer and go away very shortly to some other mast, as though the vision was unsatisfactory. During this time Mr. Cave was able to watch the proceedings of these winged people without being disturbed by their attentions, and although his report is necessarily vague and fragmentary, it is nevertheless very suggestive. Imagine the impression of humanity a Martian observer would get who, after a difficult process of preparation and with considerable fatigue to the eyes, was able to peer at London from the steeple of St. Martin's Church for stretches at longest of 4 minutes at a time. Mr. Cave was unable to ascertain if the winged Martians were the same as the Martians who hopped about the causeways and terraces, and if the latter could put on wings at will. He several times saw certain clumsy bipeds, dimly suggestive of apes, white and partially translucent, feeding among certain of the lichenous trees, and once some of these fled before one of the hopping, round-headed Martians. The latter caught one in its tentacles, and then the picture faded suddenly and left Mr. Cave most tantalizingly in the dark. On another occasion, a vast thing that Mr. Cave thought at first was some gigantic insect appeared advancing along the causeway beside the canal with extraordinary rapidity. As this drew nearer, Mr. Cave perceived that it was a mechanism of shining metals and of extraordinary complexity, and then, when he looked again, it had passed out of sight. After a time, Mr. Wace aspired to attract the attention of the Martians, and the next time that the strange eyes of one of them appeared close to the crystal, Mr. Cave cried out and sprang away, and they immediately turned on the light and began to gesticulate in a manner suggestive of signaling. But when at last Mr. Cave examined the crystal again, the Martian had departed. Thus far these observations had progressed in early November, and then Mr. Cave, feeling that the suspicions of his family about the crystal were allayed, began to take it to and fro with him in order that, as occasion arose in the daytime or night, he might comfort himself with what was fast becoming the most real thing in his existence. In December, Mr. Wace's work, in conjunction with the forthcoming examination, became heavy. The sittings were reluctantly suspended for a week, and for 10 or 11 days, he's not quite sure which, he saw nothing of Cave. He then grew anxious to resume these investigations, and the stress of his seasonal labors being abated, he went down to 7 Dials. At the corner he noticed a shutter before a bird fancier's window, and then another at the cobbler's. Mr. Cave's shop was closed. He rapped, and the door was opened by the stepson, in black. He at once called Mrs. Cave, who was, Mr. Wade could not but observe, in cheap but ample widow's weeds of the most imposing pattern. Without any very great surprise, Mr. Wace learnt that Cave was dead and already buried. She was in tears, and her voice was a little thick. She had just returned from Highgate. Her mind seemed occupied with her own prospects and the honourable details of the obsequies, but Mr. Wace was at last able to learn the particulars of Cave's death. He had been found dead in his shop in the early morning the day after his last visit to Mr. Wace, and the crystal had been clasped in his stone-cold hands. His face was smiling, said Mrs. Cave, and the velvet cloth from the minerals lay on the floor at his feet. He must have been dead 5 or 6 hours when he was found. This came as a great shock to Wace, and he began to reproach himself bitterly for having neglected the plain symptoms of the old man's ill health. But his chief thought was of the crystal. He approached that topic in a gingerly manner, because he knew Mrs. Cave's peculiarities. He was dumbfounded to learn that it was sold. Mrs. Cave's first impulse, directly after Cave's body had been taken upstairs, had been to write to the mad clergyman who had offered £5 for the crystal, informing him of its recovery. But after a violent hunt in which her daughter joined her, they were convinced of the loss of his address. As they were without the means required to mourn and bury Cave in the elaborate style the dignity of an old 7 Dials inhabitant demands, they had appealed to a friendly fellow tradesman in Great Portland Street. He had very kindly taken over a portion of the stock at a valuation. The valuation was his own, and the crystal egg was included in one of the lots. Mr. Wace, after a few suitable consolatory observations, a little offhandedly proffered perhaps, hurried at once to Great Portland Street. But there he learned that the crystal egg had already been sold to a tall, dark man in grey, and there the material facts of this curious, and to me at least very suggestive story, come abruptly to an end. The Great Portland Street dealer did not know who the tall, dark man in grey was, nor had he observed him with sufficient attention to describe him minutely. He did not even know which way this person had gone after leaving the shop. For a time Mr. Wace remained in the shop, trying the dealer's patience with hopeless questions, venting his own exasperation, and at last, realizing abruptly that the whole thing had passed out of his hands, had vanished like a vision of the night, he returned to his own rooms, a little astonished to find the notes he had made still tangible and visible upon his untidy table. His annoyance and disappointment were naturally very great. He made a second call, equally ineffectual, upon the great Portland Street dealer, and he resorted to advertisements in such periodicals as were likely to come into the hands of a bric-a-brac collector. He also wrote letters to the Daily Chronicle and Nature, but both those periodicals, suspecting a hoax, asked him to reconsider his action before they printed, and he was advised that such a strange story, unfortunately so bare of supporting evidence, might imperil his reputation as an investigator. Moreover, the calls of his proper work were urgent, so that after a month or so, save for an occasional reminder to certain dealers, he had reluctantly to abandon the quest for the crystal egg, and from that day to this it remains undiscovered. Occasionally, however, he tells me, and I can quite believe him, he has bursts of zeal in which he abandons his more urgent occupation and resumes the search. Whether or not it will remain lost forever with the material and origin of it are things equally speculative at the present time. If the present purchaser is a collector, one would have expected the inquiries of Mr. Wace to have reached him through the dealers. He has been able to discover Mr. Cave's clergyman and Oriental, no other than the Reverend James Parker and the young Prince of Bosokuni in Java. I am obliged to them for certain particulars. The object of the Prince was simple curiosity and extravagance. He was so eager to buy because Cave was so oddly reluctant to sell. It is just as possible that the buyer in the second instance was simply a casual purchaser and not a collector at all, and the crystal egg, for all I know, may be at the present moment within a mile of me, decorating a drawing room or serving as a paperweight, its remarkable functions all unknown. Indeed, it is partly with the idea of such a possibility that I have thrown this narrative into a form that will give it a chance of being read by the ordinary consumer of fiction. My own ideas in the matter are practically identical with those of Mr. Wace. I believe the crystal on the mast in Mars and the crystal egg of Mr. Cave's to be in some physical, but at present quite inexplicable way, en rapport, and we both believe further that the terrestrial crystal must have been, possibly at some remote date, sent hither from that planet in order to give the Martians a near view of our affairs. Possibly the fellows to the crystals in the other masts are also on our globe. No theory of hallucination suffices for the facts. End of The Crystal Egg by H.G. Wells.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bookman. Hard Guy by H.B. Carrollton. He was standing at the side of the glass-side superhighway. His arm half raised, thumb pointed in the same direction as that of the approaching rocket car. Ordinarily, Frederick Marden would have passed a hitchhiker without stopping, but there was something in the bearing and appearance of this one that caused him to apply his brakes. Marden opened the door next to the vacant seat behind him. "Going my way?" he asked. A pair of steady, unsmiling blue eyes looked him over. "Yeah." "All right, then, hop in." The hitchhiker took his time. He slid into the seat with casual deliberateness and slammed the car door shut. The rocket car got under way once more. They rode in silence for half a mile or so. Finally, Marden glanced questioningly at his companion's expressionless profile. "Where are you heading for?" he asked. "Dentonville." He spoke from the corner of his mouth without turning his head. "Oh yes, that's the next town, isn't it?" "Yeah." Not very communicative, reflected Marden, noticing the rather ragged condition of the other's Celolex clothing. "Have much trouble getting rides?" The passenger turned his head, his blue eyes without emotion. "Yeah. Most guys are leery about picking up hitchhikers. Scared they'll get robbed." Marden pursed his lips, nodded. "Something to that, all right. I'm pretty careful myself, but I figured you looked okay." "Can't always tell by looks," was the calm reply. Course, us guys mostly pick out some guy with a swell atomic mobile if we're going to pull a stick up. When we see a whole heap like this, there's usually not enough dough to make it pay. Martin felt his jaw drop. Say, you sound like you go in for that sort of thing. I'm telling you right now, I haven't enough cash on me to make it worth your while. I'm just a salesman, trying to get along. You got nothing to worry about, his passenger assured him. Stick-ups aren't my racket. An audible sigh of relief escaped Martin. I'm certainly glad to hear that. What is your racket, anyway? The blue eyes frosted over. Look, chum, sometimes it ain't exactly healthy to ask questions like that. Pardon me, Martin said hastily. I didn't mean anything. It's none of my business, of course. The calm eyes flickered over his contrite expression. Skip it, pal. You look like a right guy. I'll put you next to something. Only keep your lip buttoned. See? Oh, absolutely. I'm Mike Egan, head of the Strato Rovers. No. Martin was plainly awed. The Strato Rovers, eh? I've heard of them all right. The other nodded complacently. Yeah, we're about the toughest mob this side of Mars. We don't bother honest people, though. We get ours from the crooks and racketeers. They can't squeal to the interplanetary police. There's a lot in what you say, agreed Martin, and of course that puts your mob in the Robin Hood class. Robin Hood? Nuts! That guy was a dupe, running around with bows and arrows. Why, we got a mystery ray that paralyzes anybody that starts up with us. They are all right when it wears off, but by the time we get away... Martin was properly impressed. A mystery ray? With a weapon like that, you should be able to walk into a bank and clean it out without any trouble. His passenger's lips curled. I told you, we don't bother honest people. We even help the SP sometimes. Right now we're working with the Earth-Mars G-Men in rounding up a gang of fifth columnists that are planning on taking over the government. They're led by the Black Hornet. This Black Hornet goes around pretending like he's a big businessman, but he's really a international spy. A what? A international spy, repeated Martin's companion shortly. The EMG men say he's the most dangerous man in the country, but he won't last long with the Strato Rovers on his trail. Martin nodded. I can believe that. Tell me, Egan, what are you doing out here around a small Earth town like Dentonville? The government's building some kind of a ammunition place near here, and I understand the Black Hornet's figuring on wrecking everything. Of course, he won't get away with it. Scattered plasticade houses on either side of the road indicated they had reached the outskirts of Dentonville. Mike Egan pointed ahead to a small white house set back among a cluster of trees. There's where I'm holed up. Drop me in front. A young woman in a faded blue satin glass house dress was standing at the gate of the white picket fence. She watched in silence as the passenger stepped from the rocket car and lifted his hand to the driver in careless farewell. Thanks for the lift, chum, said Mike Egan. Not at all, replied Martin, glad to have been of service to Mike Egan. The woman smiled to him. He's told you his name, I see. Martin lifted his hat. Indeed he has. Michelle is all right, she said. I do think, though, that he reads too many Buck Gordon interplanetary comic books for a boy of 11. End of title. By H.B. Carrollton. Recording by Bookman.
I'm a stranger here myself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by William Hasseltine. One can't be too cautious about the people one meets in Tangier. They're all weirdies of one kind or another. Me? Oh. I'm a Stranger Here Myself, by Mac Reynolds. The Place de France is the town's hub. It marks the end of Boulevard Pasteur, the main drag of the westernized part of the city, and the beginning of Rue de la Liberté, which leads down to the Grand Soko and the Medina. In a 3-minute walk from the Place de France, you can go from an ultra-modern, California-like resort to the Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid. It's quite a town, Tangier. King-size sidewalk cafes occupy 3 of the strategic corners on the Place de France. The Café de Paris serves the best draft beer in town, gets all the better custom, and has 3 shoeshine boys attached to the establishment. You can sit on a sunny morning and read the Paris edition of the New York Times Herald Tribune while getting your shoes done up like mirrors for 30 Moroccan francs, which comes to about 5 cents at its current exchange. You can sit there, after the paper's read, sip your espresso, and watch the people go by. Tangier is probably the most cosmopolitan city in the world. In native costume, you'll see Berber and Rif, Arab and Blue Man, and occasionally a Senegalese from further south. In European dress, you'll see Japs and Chinese, Hindus and Turks, Levantines and Filipinos, North Americans and South Americans, and of course, even Europeans, from both sides of the curtain. In Tangier, you'll find some of the world's poorest and some of the richest. The poorest will try to sell you anything from a shoe shine to their not very lily-white bodies, and the rich will avoid your eyes, afraid you might try to sell them something. In spite of recent changes, the town still has its unique qualities. As a result of them, the permanent population includes smugglers and black marketeers, fugitives from justice and international con men, espionage and counter-espionage agents, homosexuals, nymphomaniacs, alcoholics, drug addicts, displaced Persians, ex-royalty, and subversives of every flavor. Local law limits the activities of a few of these. Like I said, it's quite a town. I looked up from my Herald Tribune and said, "Hello, Paul. Anything new cooking?" He sank into the chair opposite me and looked around for the waiter. The tables were all crowded, and since mine was a face he recognized, he assumed he was welcome to intrude. It was more or less standard procedure at the Café de Paris. It wasn't a place to go if you wanted to be alone. Paul said, "How are you, Rupert? Haven't seen you for donkey's years." The waiter came along, and Paul ordered a glass of beer. Paul was an easygoing, shallow-faced little man. I vaguely remembered someone saying he was from Liverpool and in exports. "What's in the newspaper?" he said disinterestedly. "Pogo and Albert are going to find a duel," I told him. "And little Abner is becoming a rock and roll singer." He grunted. "Oh," I said. "The intellectual type." I scanned the front page. "The Ruskies have put up another manned satellite." "They have, eh? How big?" "Several times bigger than anything we Americans have." The beer came and looked good, so I ordered a glass too. Paul said, "Whatever happened to those poxy flying saucers?" "What flying saucers?" A French girl went by with a poodle so finely clipped as to look as though it had been shaven. The girl was in the latest from Paris. Every pore in the place, we both looked after her. "You know, what everyone was seeing a few years ago. It's too bad none of these bloody manned satellites was up then. Maybe they would have seen one." "That's an idea," I said. We didn't say anything else for a while, and I began to wonder if I could go back to my paper without rubbing him the wrong way. I didn't know Paul very well, but, for that matter, it was completely seldom you ever got to know anybody very well in Tangier. Largely, cards were played close to the chest. My beer came and a plate of tapas for us both. Tapas at the Café de Paris are apt to be potato salad, a few anchovies, olives, and possibly some cheese. Free lunch, they used to call it in the States. "Just to say something," I said, "where do you think they come from?" And when he looked blank, I added, "The flying saucers." He grinned. "From Mars or Venus or someplace." I said, "Too bad none of them ever crashed or landed in the Yale football field and said, 'Take me to your cheerleader,' or something." Paul yawned and said, "That was always the trouble with those crackpot blokes' explanations of them. If they were aliens from space, then why not show themselves?" I ate one of the potato chips. It had been cooked in rancid olive oil. I said, "Oh, there are various answers to that one. We could probably sit around here and think of 2 or 3 that made sense." Paul was mildly interested. "Like what?" "Well, hell. Suppose, for instance, there's this big galactic league of civilized planets. But it's restricted, see? You're not eligible for membership until you, well, say, until you develop spaceflight. Then you're invited into the club. Meanwhile, they send secret missions down from time to time and keep an eye on your progress." Paul grinned at me. "I see you read the same poxy stuff I do." A Moorish girl went by dressed in a neatly tailored gray jalaba, European-style high-heeled shoes, and a pinkish silk veil, so transparent you could see she wore lipstick. Very provocative, dark eyes can be over a veil. We both looked after her. I said, "Or here's another one. Suppose you have a very advanced civilization on, say, Mars. Not Mars, no air, and too bloody dry to support life." "Don't interrupt, please," I said with mocking severity. "This is a very old civilization, and as the planet began to lose its water and air, it withdrew underground. Uses hydroponics and so forth. Husbands its water and air. Isn't that what we'd do in a few million years if Earth lost its water and air?" "I suppose so," he said. "Anyway, what about them?" "Well, they observe how man is going through a scientific boom, an industrial boom, a population boom, a boom period. Any day now, he's going to have a practical spaceship. Meanwhile, he's got the H-bomb, and the way he beats on the drums on both sides of the curtain, he's not against using it if he could get away with it." Paul said, "I got it. So they're scared and are keeping an eye on us. That's an old one. I read that a dozen times, dished up different." I shifted my shoulders. "Well, it's one possibility. I've got a better one. How's this? There's this alien life form that's way ahead of us. Their civilization is so old they don't have any record of when it began or how it was in the early days. They've gone beyond things like war and depressions and revolutions and greed for power or any of these things giving us a bad time here on Earth. They're all like scholars, get it? And some of them are pretty jolly well taken by Earth, especially the way we are right now, with all these problems, get it? Things developing so fast we don't know where we're going or how we're going to get there." I finished my beer and clapped my hands for Mooley. "How do you mean, where we're going?" "Well, take half the countries in the world today. They're trying to industrialize, modernize, catch up with the advanced countries. Look at Egypt and Israel and India and China and Yugoslavia and Brazil and all the rest. Trying to drag themselves up to the level of the advanced countries, and all using different methods of doing it. But look at those so-called advanced countries, up to their bottoms in problems. Juvenile delinquents, climbing crime and suicide rates, the loony bins full of the balmy, unemployed, threat of war, spending all their money on armaments instead of things like schools. All the bloody mess of it. Why, a man from Mars would be fascinated like." Mooley came shuffling up in his babouche slippers, and we both ordered another schooner of beer. Paul said seriously, "You know, there's only one big snag in this sort of talk. I've sorted the whole thing out before, and you always come up against this brick wall. Where are they, these observers or scholars or spies or whatever they are? Sooner or later we'd nab one of them. You know, Scotland Yard or the FBI or Russia's secret police or the French Sûreté or Interpol. This world is so deep in police, counter-espionage outfits, and security agents that an alien would slip up in time, no matter how trained he'd been. Sooner or later he'd slip up and they'd nab him." I shook my head. Not necessarily. The first time I even considered this possibility, it seemed to me that such an alien would base himself in London or New York, somewhere where he could use the libraries for research and get the daily newspapers and the magazines, be right in the center of things. But now I don't think so. I think he'd be right here in Tangier. Why Tangier? It's the one town in the world where anything goes. Nobody gives a damn about you or your affairs. For instance, I've known you a year or more now, and I haven't the slightest idea how you make your living." "That's right," Paul admitted. "In this town you seldom even ask a man where he's from. He can be British, a White Russian, a Basque, a Sikh, and no one could care less." "Where are you from, Rupert?" "California," I told him. "No, you're not," he grinned. I was taken aback. "What do you mean?" "I felt your mind probe back a few minutes ago when I was talking about Scotland Yard or the FBI possibly fleshing out an alien. Telepathy is a sense not trained by the humanoids. If they had it, your job, and mine, would be considerably more difficult. Let's face it, in spite of these human bodies we're disguised in, neither of us is humanoid. Where are you really from, Rupert? Aldebaran, I said. How about you? Deneb, he told me, shaking. We had a laugh and ordered another round of beer. What are you doing here on Earth? I asked him. Researching for one of our meat trusts. We're protein eaters. Humanoid flesh is considered quite a delicacy. How about you? Scouting the place for thrill tourists. My job is to go around to these backward cultures and help stir up intertribal, or international, conflicts, all according to how advanced they are. Then our tourists come in, well shielded of course, and get their kicks watching it. Paul frowned. That sort of practice could spoil an awful lot of good meat. End of I'm a Stranger Here Myself by Mac Reynolds. Recorded by William Hasseltine.
By H.G. Wells. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Greg Marguerite. The New Accelerator by H.G. Wells. Certainly, if ever a man found a guinea when he was looking for a pin, it is my good friend Professor Gibberne. I have heard before of investigators overshooting the mark, but never quite to the extent that he has done. He has really, this time at any rate, without any touch of exaggeration in the phrase, found something to revolutionize human life. And that when he was simply seeking an all-around nervous stimulant to bring languid people up to the stresses of these pushful days. I have tasted the stuff now several times, and I cannot do better than describe the effect the thing had on me. That there are astonishing experiences in store for all in search of new sensations will become apparent enough. Professor Gibberne, as many people know, is my neighbor in Folkestone. Unless my memory plays me a trick, his portrait at various ages has already appeared in the Strand magazine. I think late in 1899, but I am unable to look it up because I have lent that volume to someone who has never sent it back. The reader may perhaps recall the high forehead and the singularly long black eyebrows that give such a Mephistophelian touch to his face. He occupies one of those pleasant little detached houses in the mixed style that make the western end of the upper Sandgate Road so interesting. His is the one with the Flemish gables and the Moorish portico, and it is in the little room with the mullioned bay window that he works when he is down here, and in which of an evening we have so often smoked and talked together. He is a mighty jester, but besides, he likes to talk to me about his work. He is one of those men who find a help and stimulus in talking, and so I have been able to follow the conception of the New Accelerator right up from a very early stage. Of course, the greater portion of his experimental work is not done in Folkestone, but in Gower Street, in the fine new laboratory next to the hospital that he has been the first to use. As everyone knows, or at least as all intelligent people know, the special department in which Gibberne has gained so great and deserved a reputation among physiologists is the action of drugs upon the nervous system. Among soporifics, sedatives, and anesthetics he is, I am told, unequaled. He is also a chemist of considerable eminence, and I suppose in the subtle and complex jungle of riddles that centers about the ganglion cell and the axis fiber there are little cleared places of his making, little glades of illumination that, until he sees fit to publish his results, are still inaccessible to every other living man. And in the last few years he has been particularly assiduous upon this question of nervous stimulants, and already, before the discovery of the New Accelerator, very successful with them. Medical science has to thank him for at least 3 distinct and absolutely safe invigorators of unrivaled value to practicing men. In cases of exhaustion, the preparation known as Gibberne's B syrup has, I suppose, saved more lives already than any lifeboat round the coast. But none of these little things begin to satisfy me yet, he told me nearly a year ago. Either they increase the central energy without affecting the nerves, or they simply increase the available energy by lowering the nervous conductivity. And all of them are unequal and local in their operation. One wakes up the heart and viscera and leaves the brain stupefied. One gets at the brain champagne fashion and does nothing good for the solar plexus. And what I want, and what, if it's an earthly possibility, I mean to have, is a stimulant that stimulates all round, that wakes you up for a time from the crown of your head to the tip of your great toe, and makes you go 2 or even 3 to everybody else's 1, eh? That's the thing I'm after." "It would tire a man," I said. "Not a doubt of it, and you'd eat double or treble and all that. But just think what the thing would mean. Imagine yourself with a little vial like this." He held up a little bottle of green glass and marked his points with it. "And in the precious vial is the power to think twice as fast, move twice as quickly, do twice as much work in a given time as you could otherwise do." "But is such a thing possible?" "I believe so. If it isn't, I've wasted my time for a year. These various preparations of hypophosphites, for example, seem to show that something of the sort, even if it was only 1.5 times as fast, it would do." "It would do," I said. "If you were a statesman in a corner, for example, time rushing up against you, something urgent to be done, eh?" "He could dose his private secretary," I said, "and gain double time. And think, if you, for example, wanted to finish a book." "Usually," I said, "I wish I'd never begun 'em." "Or a doctor, driven to death, wants to sit down and think out a case, or a barrister, or a man cramming for an examination." "Worth a guinea a drop," said I, "and more to men like that." "And in a duel again," said Gibberne, "where it all depends on your quickness in pulling the trigger." "Or in fencing," I echoed. "You see," said Gibberne, "if I get it as an all-round thing, it will really do you no harm at all, except perhaps to an infinitesimal degree it brings you nearer old age. You will just have lived twice to other people's once." "I suppose," I meditated, "in a duel it would be fair?" "That's a question for the seconds," said Gibberne. I harked back further. "And you really think such a thing is possible?" I said. "As possible," said Gibberne, and glanced at something that went throbbing by his window, "as a motor bus. As a matter of fact." He paused and smiled at me deeply and tapped slowly on the edge of his desk with the green vial. "I think I know the stuff. Already I've got something coming." The nervous smile upon his face betrayed the gravity of his revelation. He rarely talked of his actual experimental work unless things were very near the end. "And it may be, I shouldn't be surprised, it may even do the thing at a greater rate than twice." "It will be rather a big thing," I hazarded. "It will be, I think, rather a big thing." But I don't think he quite knew what a big thing it was to be, for all that. I remember we had several talks about the stuff after that. The new Accelerator, he called it, and his tone about it grew more confident on each occasion. Sometimes he talked nervously of unexpected physiological results its use might have, and then he would get a little unhappy. At others he was frankly mercenary, and we debated long and anxiously how the preparation might be turned to commercial account. "It's a good thing," said Gibberne, "a tremendous thing. I know I'm giving the world something, and I think it only reasonable we should expect the world to pay. The dignity of science is all very well, but I think somehow I must have the monopoly of the stuff for, say, 10 years. I don't see why all the fun in life should go to the dealers in ham." My own interest in the coming drug certainly did not wane in time. I have always had a queer little twist towards metaphysics in my mind. I have always been given to paradoxes about space and time, and it seemed to me that Gibberne was really preparing no less than the absolute acceleration of life. Suppose a man repeatedly dosed with such a preparation. He would live an active and record life indeed, but he would be an adult at 11, middle-aged at 25, and by 30 well on the road to senile decay. It seemed to me that so far Gibberne was only going to do for anyone who took his drug exactly what Nature had done for the Jews and Orientals, who are men in their teens and aged by 50, and quicker in thought and act than we are all the time. The marvel of drugs has always been great to my mind. You can madden a man, calm a man, make him incredibly strong and alert, or a helpless log, quicken this passion and allay that, all by means of drugs. And here was a new miracle to be added to this strange armory of vials the doctors use. But Gibberne was far too eager upon his technical points to enter very keenly into my aspect of the question. It was the 7th or 8th of August when he told me the distillation that would decide his failure or success for a time was going forward as we talked, and it was on the 10th that he told me the thing was done and the new Accelerator a tangible reality in the world. I met him as I was going up the Sandgate Hill towards Folkestone. I think I was going to get my hair cut, and he came hurrying down to meet me. I suppose he was coming to my house to tell me at once of his success. I remember that his eyes were unusually bright, and his face flushed, and I noted even then the swift alacrity of his step. "It's done!" he cried, and gripped my hand, speaking very fast. "It's more than done! Come up to my house and see!" "Really?" "Really!" he shouted. "Incredibly! Come up and see!" "And it does twice?" "It does more, much more. It scares me. Come up and see the stuff. Taste it. Try it. It's the most amazing stuff on earth." He gripped my arm, and walking at such a pace that he forced me into a trot, went shouting with me up the hill. A whole char-a-banc full of people turned and stared at us in unison, after the manner of people in chars-a-banc. It was one of those hot, clear days that Folkestone sees so much of, every color incredibly bright, and every outline hard. There was a breeze, of course, but not so much breeze as sufficed under these conditions to keep me cool and dry. I panted for mercy. "I'm not walking too fast, am I?" cried Gibberne, and slackened his pace to a quick march. "You've been taking some of this stuff," I puffed. "No," he said, "at the utmost a drop of water that stood in a beaker from which I had washed out the last traces of the stuff. I took some last night, you know, but that is ancient history now." "And it goes twice?" I said, nearing his doorway in a grateful perspiration. "It goes 1,000 times, many thousand times!" cried Gibberne, with a dramatic gesture, flinging open his early English carved oak gate. "Whew!" said I, and followed him to the door. "I don't know how many times it goes," he said, with his latchkey in his hand. "And you?" "It throws all sorts of light on nervous physiology. It kicks the theory of vision into a perfectly new shape. Heaven knows how many thousand times. We'll try all that after. The thing is to try the stuff now." "Try the stuff?" I said, as we went along the passage. "Rather," said Gibberne, turning on me in his study. "There it is, in that little green vial there. Unless you happen to be afraid." I am a careful man by nature, and only theoretically adventurous. I was afraid. But on the other hand, there is pride. "Well," I haggled, "you say you've tried it?" "I've tried it," he said, "and I don't look hurt by it, do I? I don't even look livery, and I feel—" I sat down. "Give me the potion," I said. "If the worst comes to worst, it will save me having my hair cut, and that, I think, is one of the most hateful duties of a civilized man. How do you take the mixture?" "With water," said Gibberne, whacking down a carafe. He stood up in front of his desk and regarded me in his easy chair. His manner was suddenly affected by a touch of the Harley Street specialist. "It's rum stuff, you know," he said. I made a gesture with my hand. "I must warn you in the first place, as soon as you've got it down, to shut your eyes, and open them very cautiously in a minute or so's time. One still sees. The sense of vision is a question of length of vibration, and not of multitude of impacts. But there's a kind of shock to the retina, a nasty, giddy confusion, just at the time, if the eyes are open. Keep 'em shut." "Shut," I said. "Good. And the next thing is, keep still. Don't begin to whack about. You may fetch something a nasty rap if you do. Remember, you will be going several thousand times faster than you ever did before. Heart, lungs, muscles, brain, everything. And you will hit hard without knowing it. You won't know it, you know. You'll feel just as you do now, only everything in the world will seem to be going ever so many thousand times slower than it ever went before. That's what makes it so deuced queer." "Lord," I said, "and you mean—" "You'll see," said he, and took up a little measure. He glanced at the material on his desk. "Glasses," he said. "Water. All here. Mustn't take too much for the first attempt." A little vial glucked out its precious contents. "Don't forget what I told you," he said, turning the contents of the measure into a glass in the manner of an Italian waiter measuring whiskey. "Sit with the eyes tightly shut and in absolute stillness for 2 minutes," he said. "Then you will hear me speak." He added an inch or so of water to the little dose in each glass. "By the by," he said, "don't put your glass down. Keep it in your hand and rest it on your knee. Yes, so. And now—" He raised his glass. "The new Accelerator," I said. "The new Accelerator," he answered, and we touched glasses and drank, and instantly I closed my eyes. You know that blank non-existence into which one drops when one has taken gas? For an indefinite interval it was like that. Then I heard Gibberne telling me to wake up, and I stirred and opened my eyes. There he stood, as he had been standing, glass still in hand. It was empty. That was all the difference. "Well?" said I. "Nothing out of the way?" "Nothing. A slight feeling of exhilaration, perhaps. Nothing more." "Sounds?" "Things are still," I said. "By Jove, yes, they are still. Except the sort of faint patter like rain falling on different things. What is it?" "Analyzed sounds, I think," he said, "but I'm not sure." He glanced at the window. "Have you ever seen a curtain before a window fixed in that way before?" I followed his eyes, and there was the end of the curtain, frozen, as it were, corner high, in the act of flapping briskly in the breeze. "No," said I. "That's odd." "And here," he said, and opened the hand that held the glass. Naturally I winced, expecting the glass to smash, but so far from smashing it did not even seem to stir. It hung in mid-air, motionless. "Roughly speaking," said Gibberne, "an object in these latitudes falls 16 feet in the first second. This glass is falling 16 feet in a second now, only you see it hasn't been falling yet for the 100th part of a second. That gives you some idea of the pace of my accelerator." And he waved his hand round and round over and under the slowly sinking glass. Finally he took it by the bottom, pulled it down, and placed it very carefully on the table. "Eh?" he said to me, and laughed. "That seems all right," I said, and began very gingerly to raise myself from the chair. I felt perfectly well, very light and comfortable, and quite confident in my mind. I was going fast all over. My heart, for example, was beating 1,000 times a second, but that caused me no discomfort at all. I looked out of the window. An immovable cyclist, head down, with a frozen puff of dust behind his driving wheel, scorched to overtake a galloping char a banc that did not stir. I gaped in amazement at this incredible spectacle. "Gibberne," I cried, "how long will this confounded stuff last?" "Heaven knows," he answered. "Last time I took it I went to bed and slept it off. I tell you, I was frightened. It must have lasted some minutes. I think it seemed like hours, but after a bit it slows down rather suddenly, I believe." I was proud to observe that I did not feel frightened. I suppose because there were two of us. "Why shouldn't we go out?" I asked. "Why not?" "They'll see us." "Not they. Goodness, no. Why, we shall be going 1,000 times faster than the quickest conjuring trick that ever was done. Come along. Which way shall we go, window or door?" And out by the window we went. Assuredly, of all the strange experiences that I have ever had, or imagined, or read of other people having or imagining, that little raid I made with Gibberne on the Folkestone Leas under the influence of the new Accelerator was the strangest and maddest of all. We went out by his gate into the road, and there we made a minute examination of the statuesque passing traffic. The tops of the wheels and some of the legs of the horses of this char a banc, the end of the whiplash, and the lower jaw of the conductor, who was just beginning to yawn, were perceptibly in motion, but all the rest of the lumbering conveyance seemed still, and quite noiseless except for a faint rattling that came from one man's throat. And as parts of this frozen edifice there were a driver, you know, and a conductor, and 11 people. The effect as we walked about the thing began by being madly queer and ended by being disagreeable. There they were, people like ourselves, and yet not like ourselves, frozen in careless attitudes, caught in mid-gesture. A girl and a man smiled at one another, a leering smile that threatened to last forevermore. A woman in a floppy capelline rested her arms on the rail and stared at Gibberne's house with the unwinking stare of eternity. A man stroked his mustache like a figure of wax, and another stretched a tiresome stiff hand with extended fingers towards his loosened hat. We stared at them, we laughed at them, we made faces at them, and then a sort of disgust of them came upon us, and we turned away and walked round in front of the cyclist towards the Leas. "Goodness!" cried Gibberne suddenly. "Look there!" He pointed, and there, at the tip of his finger, and sliding down the air with wings flapping slowly and at the speed of an exceptionally languid snail, was a bee. And so we came out upon the Leas. There the thing seemed madder than ever. The band was playing in the upper stand, though all the sound it made for us was a low-pitched, wheezy rattle, a sort of prolonged last sigh that passed at times into a sound like the slow, muffled ticking of some monstrous clock. Frozen people stood erect, strange, silent, self-conscious-looking dummies hung unstably in mid-air, promenading upon the grass. I passed close to a little poodle dog suspended in the act of leaping, and watched the slow movement of his legs as he sank to earth. "Lord, look here!" cried Gibberne, and we halted for a moment before a magnificent person in white faint striped flannels, white shoes, and a Panama hat, who turned back to wink at two gaily dressed ladies he had passed. A wink, studied with such leisurely deliberation as we could afford, is an unattractive thing. It loses any quality of alert gaiety, and one remarks that the winking eye does not completely close, that under its drooping lid appears the lower edge of an eyeball and a little line of white. "Heaven give me memory," said I, "and I will never wink again." "Or smile," said Gibberne, with his eye on the lady's answering teeth. "It's infernally hot, somehow," said I. "Let's go slower." "Oh, come along," said Gibberne. We picked our way among the bath chairs in the path. Many of the people sitting in the chairs seemed almost natural in their passive poses, but the contorted scarlet of the bandsman was not a restful thing to see. A purple-faced little gentleman was frozen in the midst of a violent struggle to refold his newspaper against the wind. There were many evidences that these people, in their sluggish way, were exposed to a considerable breeze, a breeze that had no existence so far as our sensations went. We came out and walked a little way from the crowd, and turned and regarded it. To see all that multitude changed to a picture, smitten rigid, as it were, into the semblance of realistic wax, was impossibly wonderful. It was absurd, of course, but it filled me with an irrational and exultant sense of superior advantage. Consider the wonder of it. All that I had said and thought and done since the stuff had begun to work in my veins had happened, so far as those people, so far as the world in general went, in the twinkling of an eye. "The new Accelerator," I began, but Gibberne interrupted me. "There's that infernal old woman," he said. "What old woman?" "Lives next door to me," said Gibberne. "Has a lapdog that yaps. Gods, the temptation is strong." There is something very boyish and impulsive about Gibberne at times. Before I could expostulate with him, he had dashed forward, snatched the unfortunate animal out of visible existence, and was running violently with it towards the cliff of the Lies. It was most extraordinary. The little brute, you know, didn't bark or wiggle or make the slightest sign of vitality. It kept quite stiffly in an attitude of somnolent repose, and Gibberne held it by the neck. It was like running about with a dog of wood. "Gibberne," I cried, "put it down." Then I said something else. "If you run like that, Gibberne," I cried, "you'll set your clothes on fire. Your linen trousers are going brown as it is." He clapped his hand on his thigh and stood hesitating on the verge. "Gibberne," I cried, coming up, "put it down. This heat is too much. It's our running so, 2 or 3 miles a second. Friction of the air." "What?" he said, glancing at the dog. "Friction of the air," I shouted. "Friction of the air, going too fast, like meteorites and things. Too hot. And Gibberne, I'm all over prickling and a sort of perspiration. You can see people stirring slightly. I believe the stuff's working off. Put that dog down." "Eh?" he said. "It's working off," I repeated. "We're too hot, and the stuff's working off. I'm wet through." He stared at me, then at the band, the wheezy rattle of whose performance was certainly going faster. Then, with a tremendous sweep of the arm, he hurled the dog away from him, and it went spinning upward, still inanimate, and hung at last over the grouped parasols of a knot of chattering people. Gibberne was gripping my elbow. "By Jove!" he cried, "I believe it is. A sort of hot pricking, and yes, that man's moving his pocket handkerchief perceptibly. We must get out of this sharp." But we could not get out of it sharply enough. Luckily, perhaps, for we might have run, and if we had run we should, I believe, have burst into flames. Almost certainly we should have burst into flames. You know, we had neither of us thought of that. But before we could even begin to run, the action of the drug had ceased. It was the business of a minute fraction of a second. The effect of the new Accelerator passed like the drawing of a curtain, vanished in the moment of a hand. I heard Gibberne's voice in infinite alarm. "Sit down," he said, and flopped down upon the turf at the edge of the Lies. I sat, scorching as I sat. There is a patch of burnt grass there still where I sat down. The whole stagnation seemed to wake up as I did so. The disarticulated vibration of the band rushed together into a blast of music. The promenaders put their feet down and walked their ways. The papers and flags began flapping. Smiles passed into words. The winker finished his wink and went on his way complacently, and all the seated people moved and spoke. The whole world had come alive again, was going as fast as we were, or rather we were going no faster than the rest of the world. It was like slowing down as one comes into a railway station. Everything seemed to spin around for a second or two. I had the most transient feeling of nausea, and that was all. And the little dog, which had seemed to hang for a moment when the force of Gibbern's arm was expended, fell with a swift acceleration clean through a lady's parasol. That was the saving of us, unless it was for one corpulent old gentleman in a bath chair, who certainly did start at the sight of us, and afterwards regarded us at intervals with a darkly suspicious eye, and finally, I believe, said something to his nurse about us. I doubt if a solitary person remarked our sudden appearance among them. Plop! We must have appeared abruptly. We ceased to smolder almost at once, though the turf beneath me was uncomfortably hot. The attention of everyone, including even the Amusements Association band, which on this occasion, for the only time in its history, got out of tune, was arrested by the amazing fact, and the still more amazing yapping and uproar caused by the fact that a respectable, overfed lapdog sleeping quietly to the east of the bandstand should suddenly fall through the parasol of a lady on the west, in a slightly singed condition due to the extreme velocity of his movements through the air. In these absurd days, too, when we are all trying to be as psychic and silly and superstitious as possible, people got up and trod on other people. Chairs were overturned. The Lies policeman ran. How the matter settled itself I do not know. We were much too anxious to disentangle ourselves from the affair and get out of range of the eye of the old gentleman in the bath chair to make minute inquiries. As soon as we were sufficiently cool and sufficiently recovered from our giddiness and nausea and confusion of mind to do so, we stood up, and skirting the crowd, directed our steps back along the road below the metropole towards Gibbern's house. But amidst the din I heard very distinctly the gentleman who had been sitting beside the lady of the ruptured sunshade using quite unjustifiable threats and language to one of those chair attendants who have "Inspector" written on their caps. "If you didn't throw the dog," he said, "who did?" The sudden return of movement and familiar noises, and our natural anxiety about ourselves (our clothes were still dreadfully hot, and the fronts of the thighs of Gibbern's white trousers were scorched a drabbish brown), prevented the minute observations I should have liked to make on all these things. Indeed, I really made no observations of any scientific value on that return. The bee, of course, had gone. I looked for that cyclist, but he was already out of sight as we came into the upper Sandgate Road, or hidden from us by traffic. The char a banc, however, with its people now all alive and stirring, was clattering along at a spanking pace, almost abreast of the nearer church. We noted, however, that the window-sill on which we had stepped in getting out of the house was slightly singed, and that the impressions of our feet on the gravel of the path were unusually deep. So it was I had my first experience of the new Accelerator. Practically we had been running about and saying and doing all sorts of things in the space of a second or so of time. We had lived half an hour, while the band had played perhaps 2 bars, but the effect it had upon us was that the whole world had stopped for our convenient inspection. Considering all things, and particularly considering our rashness in venturing out of the house, the experience might certainly have been much more disagreeable than it was. It showed, no doubt, that Gibbern has still much to learn before his preparation is a manageable convenience, but its practicability is certainly demonstrated beyond all cavil. Since that adventure he has been steadily bringing its use under control, and I have several times, and without the slightest bad result, taken measured doses under his direction, though I must confess I have not yet ventured abroad again while under its influence. I may mention, for example, that this story has been written at one sitting and without interruption, except for the nibbling of some chocolate. By its means I began at 6:25, and my watch is now very nearly at the minute past the half hour. The convenience of securing a long, uninterrupted spell of work in the midst of a day full of engagements cannot be exaggerated. Gibbern is now working at the quantitative handling of his preparation, with a special reference to its distinctive effects upon different types of constitution. He then hopes to find a retarder with which to dilute its present rather excessive potency. The retarder will, of course, have the reverse effect to the accelerator. Used alone, it should enable the patient to spread a few seconds over many hours of ordinary time, and so to maintain an apathetic inaction, a glacier-like absence of alacrity, amidst the most animated or irritating surroundings. The two things together must necessarily work an entire revolution in civilized existence. It is the beginning of our escape from that time garment of which Carlyle speaks. While this accelerator will enable us to concentrate ourselves with tremendous impact upon any moment or occasion that demands our utmost sense and vigor, the retarder will enable us to pass in passive tranquility through infinite hardship and tedium. Perhaps I am a little optimistic about the retarder, which has indeed still to be discovered, but about the accelerator there is no possible sort of doubt whatever. Its appearance upon the market in a convenient, controllable, and assimilable form is a matter of the next few months. It will be obtainable of all chemists and druggists in small green bottles, at a high, but, considering its extraordinary qualities, by no means excessive price. Gibbern's Nervous Accelerator it will be called, and he hopes to be able to supply it in 3 strengths, one in the 200, one in 900, and one in 2000, distinguished by yellow, pink, and white labels respectively. No doubt its use renders a great number of very extraordinary things possible, for, of course, the most remarkable and possibly even criminal proceedings may be effected with impunity by this dodging, as it were, into the interstices of time. Like all potent preparations, it will be liable to abuse. We have, however, discussed this aspect of the question very thoroughly, and we have decided that this is purely a matter of medical jurisprudence, and altogether outside our province. We shall manufacture and sell the accelerator, and as for the consequences, we shall see. End of The New Accelerator by H.G. Wells.
Radiant Shell by Paul Ernst. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Radiant Shell. And that, gentlemen, said the Secretary of War, is the situation. Arvania has stolen the Ziegler plans and formulae. With their acquisition, it becomes the most powerful nation on Earth. The Ziegler plans are at present in the Arvanian embassy, but they will be smuggled out of the country soon. Within a month of their landing in Arvania, war will be declared against us. That means, he glanced at the tense faces around the conference table, that we have about 3 months to live as a nation, unless we can get those plans. There was a hushed, appalled silence, broken at last by General Forsyth. Nonsense! How can a postage-stamp country like Arvania really threaten us? The day has passed, General, said the Secretary, when a nation's power is reckoned by its size. The Ziegler heat ray is the deadliest weapon yet invented. 1,000 men, with a dozen of the ray projectors, can reduce us to smoking ruins while remaining far outside the range of our guns. No, I tell you, that declaration of war by Arvania will be followed by the downfall of the United States inside of 3 months. Again, the hushed, strained silence descended over the conference table, while one white-faced man gazed at another, and all speculated on the incredible possibility of a world in which there was no United States of America. We must get the plans, nodded Forsyth, convinced at last. But how? March openly on the Arvanian embassy? No, that would be a declaration of war on our part. The World Court, which knows nothing of the Ziegler plans, would set the league at our throats. Send volunteers unofficially to raid the place? Impossible. There is a heavy guard in the Arvanian embassy, and I more than suspect the place bristles with machine guns. What are we to do? Demanded Forsyth. The Secretary seemed to have been waiting for that final question. I have had an odd and desperate plan submitted me from an outside source. I could not pass it without your approval. I will let you hear it from the lips of the planner. He pressed a buzzer. Bring Mr. Winter in, he told his secretary. The man who presently appeared in the doorway was an arresting figure. A man of 30-odd, with the body of an athlete, belied somewhat by the pallor of an indoor worker, with acid-stained, delicate hands, offset by forearms that might have belonged to a blacksmith, with coal-black hair and gray eyes so light as to look like ice-gray holes in the deep caverns of his eye sockets. This was Thorn Winter. "Gentlemen, the scientist, Mr. Winter," announced the secretary. "He thinks he can get the Ziegler plans." Thorn Winter cleared his throat. "My scheme is simple enough," he said tersely. "I believe I can walk right into the embassy, get the plans, and then walk right out again. It sounds kind of impossible, but I think I can work it by making myself invisible." "Invisible?" echoed Forsythe. "Invisible?" "Precisely," said Thorn, in a matter-of-fact tone. "I have just turned out a camouflage which is the most perfect yet discovered. It was designed for application to guns and equipment only. I never thought of trying to cover a human body with it, but I'm sure it can be done." "But invisible?" muttered Forsythe, glancing askance at Winter. "There's no time for argument," said the secretary crisply. "The question is, shall we give this man permission to try the apparently impossible?" All heads nodded, though in all eyes was doubt. The secretary turned to the scientist. "You are aware of the risk you run. You realize that if you are caught, we cannot recognize you, that we must disclaim official knowledge of your work and leave you to your fate." Thorn nodded. "Then," said the secretary, his voice vibrant, "yours is the mission, and on your effort hangs the fate of your country. Now, what help will you require?" "Only the assistance of one man," said Thorn, "and since secrecy is vital, I'm going to ask you, sir, to be that man." The secretary smiled, and with that smile he seemed to be transformed from a great leader of affairs into a kindly human individual. "I am honored, Mr. Winter," he said. "Shall we go at once to your laboratory?" In the great laboratory room, the secretary glanced about almost uneasily at the crowding apparatus that was such an enigma to one untrained in science. Then his gaze returned to Winter's activities. Thorn was carefully stirring fluids, poured drop by drop from various retorts in a mixing bowl. All the fluids were colorless, and they combined in a mixture that had approximately the consistency of thin syrup. To this Thorn added a carefully weighted pinch of glittering powder. Then he lit a burner under the bowl and thrust into the mixture a tiny, specially constructed thermometer. "You can really make yourself invisible?" breathed the secretary. "I can," said Thorn. "If the blisters don't upset my calculations by making my body surfaces too moist for the stuff to stick to, I'm going to have you paint me with it, you see, and it was never intended to cover flesh." He regulated the burner anxiously, and then began to take off his clothes. "Ready," he said at last, glancing at the thermometer and turning off the burner. He stood before the wondering secretary, a fine, muscular figure. "Take this brush and cover me with the stuff, and be sure not to miss any of me." And then the secretary saw why Thorn had said the colorless paint was never intended to be applied to human flesh, for it was still seething and smoking in the cauldron. "Good heavens!" he said. "Don't you want to wait till it cools a little?" "Can't," said Thorn. "It has to be applied hot or it loses its flexibility." The secretary dipped the brush and began to paint the naked flesh of the scientist. Not a quiver touched that flesh as an almost microscopically thin, colorless layer formed into a film after the brush strokes. But the secretary's fingers shook a little. "My God, man," he said finally, "doesn't it hurt?" "It's a little like being boiled in oil," replied Thorn grimly. "Outside of that, it's all right. Hurry, before the stuff gets too cool." The clinging thin shell covered him to his chest, then to his throat. At that point he reached into a drawer in a workbench beside him and drew out two small, hollow hemispheres of glass. These he cupped over his eyes. "What are those for?" asked the secretary. "So my eyes can be covered with the film. If they weren't, I'd present the somewhat remarkable spectacle of a pair of disembodied eyes walking down the street." Painfully, agonizingly, the hot film was applied to throat and face, over the glass spheres that cupped around the eyes, over a tight leather cap covering the scientist's hair, and over a sort of football nose guard which extended down an inch below the end of Thorn's nose in a sort of overhanging offset that would allow him to breathe and still keep his nostrils hidden. The secretary stepped back. Before him stood a figure that looked not unlike a glazed statue of a man. The effect was that of a body encased in clear ice, and like clear ice, the encasing shell sparkled and glittered radiantly in the sunlight that poured in at the windows. Thorn moved. His glazed arms and legs and torso glistened with all the colors in the spectrum, while under the filmed bulges of glass his eyes looked as large as apples. The secretary felt a chill of superstitious fear as he gazed at that weird and glittering figure with its enormous glazed eyes. "But you aren't invisible," he said at length. "That comes now," said Thorn, walking ahead of the secretary, while on the ceiling above him danced red and yellow and blue rainbows of refracted light. He stepped onto a big metal plate. Suspended above was a huge metal ring, with a hole directly over the spot on which he stood. "Soft magnets," explained Thorn. "As simply as I can put it, my process for rendering an object invisible is this. I place the object, coated with the film, on this plate. Then I start in motion the overhead ring, creating an immensely powerful, rapidly rotating magnetic field. The rotating field rearranges the atoms of this peculiarly susceptible film of mine so that they will transmit light rays with the least possible resistance. It combs the atoms into straight lines, you might say. With that straight line, least resistance arrangement, comes invisibility." "I don't quite see," began the secretary. "Refraction of light," said Thorn hurriedly. "The light rays strike this film, hurtle around the object it coats, at increased speed, probably, but there are no instruments accurate enough to check that, and emerge on the other side. Thus you can look at a body so filmed, and not see it. Your gaze travels around it and rests on objects in a straight line behind it. But you'll see for yourself in a moment. Pull that switch there, will you? And leave it on for 2 full minutes after you have ceased to see me." Straight and tall, a figure encased in shimmering crystal, the scientist stood on the metal plate. Hesitant, with the superstitious dread growing in his heart, the secretary stood with his hand on the switch. That hand pulled the switch down. Soundlessly, the overhead metal ring began to whirl, gathering speed with every second. And then, though he had known in advance something of what was coming, the secretary could not suppress a shout of surprise. The man before him on the metal plate was vanishing. Slowly he disappeared from view. Slowly, as an object sinking deeper and deeper into clear water disappears. Now the face was but a white blob. Now the entire body was a misty blur. And now a shade, a wavering shadow, alone marked Winter's presence. The secretary could not have told the exact instant when that last faint blur oozed from sight. He only knew that at one second he was gazing at it, and at the next second his eyes rested on a rack of test tubes on the wall beyond the plate. He looked at his watch. Sweat glistened in tiny points on the hand that held the switch. It was all so like death, this disappearance, as if he had thrown the switch that electrocuted a man. The specified 2 minutes passed. He cut off the power. The great ring lost speed, stopped whirling, and on the plate was nothing. At least it seemed there was nothing. But a moment later a deep voice sounded out, "I guess I'm invisible, all right, according to the expression on your face." "You are," said the secretary, mopping his forehead, "except when you speak. Then I have the bizarre experience of seeing glimpses of teeth, tongue, and throat hanging in midair. I'd never have believed it if I hadn't witnessed it myself. That paint of yours is miraculous." "A little complicated, but hardly miraculous. It has a cellulose base, and there is in it a small % of powdered crystal. But the rest I'll keep locked in my brain alone till my country has need of it." The glimpses of teeth and tongue and throat ceased. In spite of himself, the secretary started as an unseen hand touched his shoulder. "Now," there was a ringing resolution in the deep voice, "for the Arvanian Embassy. Please drive me there, and be as quick as you can about it. I can't last for very long with this film sealing most of the pores of my body." The secretary started for the laboratory door. Beside him sounded the patter of bare feet. He opened the door and walked into the hallway. Behind him, apparently of itself, the door clicked shut, and the footsteps again sounded beside him. The secretary walked to the curb where his limousine waited. His chauffeur jumped out and opened the door. The secretary paused a moment, one foot on the running board, to draw a cigar from his pocket and light it. During that moment the car pressed down on that side, and as suddenly rocked back up again. The chauffeur stared wide-eyed at his employer. "Did you do that, sir?" he asked. "Do what?" said the secretary. "Push down on the running board with your foot." "Of course not," said the secretary, his eyebrows raising. "You could have seen my leg move if I had. But why do you ask?" "It felt like somebody got into this car," mumbled the man. "Did you see anybody get in?" said the secretary with a shrug. And, shaking his head, with a fuddled look in his eyes, the chauffeur turned away and got into the driver's seat. The secretary glanced at the rear seat. On the far side, the cushion was heavily depressed. He sat on the near side, feeling his knee strike another, unseen knee. "Drive to the Bulgarian Embassy," he told his man. Up 16th Street, the car swung, past the various embassies which looked more like palatial private villas than offices of foreign nations. Toward the end of the line, a smaller building than most of the others, was the Arvanian Embassy. Next to it was the Bulgarian. The car stopped in front of the Bulgarian Embassy, and the secretary got out. Again he paused, while the chauffeur held the door open, to hold a match to his cigar. Again the car sagged down on that side, and slowly swayed up again. "Hey!" said the chauffeur, but meeting the secretary's calmly inquiring gaze, he stopped. Scratching his head, he went back to the wheel, while the secretary walked toward the building entrance. Behind him, moving on soundless bare feet along the sidewalk, Thorne Winter hastened, cloaked in invisibility, toward the Arvanian Embassy, and the plans that spelled America's destruction if they remained in Arvanian hands. The embassy building was a 3-storied oblong house of white stone topping a terrace that started its climb from the sidewalk of 16th Street. The doors at the head of the wide stone staircase were of bronze, and they were closed, and, Thorne surmised, efficiently barred. The windows at front and sides were also closed, in spite of the warmth of the sunny spring afternoon. Beside the building, leading up in a short steep hill, was the driveway. Up this Thorn started. The front of the house was hopelessly barred, but at the rear entrance there might be a chance. Up the driveway, then, he walked, a little startled at the fact that he cast no shadow, feeling as a ghost might feel. The pavement was hot to his thinly filmed feet. A little dubious as to the effect of heat on the vital shell that hit him, he stepped off into the cool grass beside the drive and came soon to the rear of the embassy. There was no porch or veranda, simply 2 stone steps leading up to a stout oak door which opened onto the embassy kitchens. From behind this door came the sound of crockery and the hum of voices. The Arvanian chef evidently was preparing afternoon tea. Walking boldly to the very steps, Thorn began the vigil that should end when someone came in or out of that door, allowing him to slip inside the building before the portal was barred shut again. For nearly half an hour Thorn stood there before something happened that at once helped him and at the same time nearly proved his undoing. A light delivery van sped up the driveway. The wheels stirred up a cloud of dust. It was a very small cloud of very fine dust. Thorn at first thought nothing of it, because he was so engrossed in the conviction that here ought to be provided an entrance into the house. The truck driver got out, took a crate from the body of the van, and went with it to the back door. After a moment of waiting, the door opened. Thorn noticed that it was opened very cautiously, only an inch or so. He caught a glimpse of a heavy chain stretched across the inch opening, and saw a strip of bearded, resolute face. The door was unchained. The driver walked in, while the door stood open. Thorn started to glide in after him. Mere chance made him glance at a window near the door. The window framed another bearded, resolute face, and the eyes in that face were like saucers as they stared full at Thorn. For an instant Thorn knew icy fear. His invisibility! Had something happened to strip him of that concealing mantle? But what could have happened? He glanced down at himself, and saw the reason for the guard's saucer-eyed expression. A little of the light cloud of dust stirred up by the truck wheels had settled over him and clung to the encasing shell. As he moved, these dust specks moved. The effect to the staring guard, Thorn realized, must be that of seeing a queer, fine dust column moving eccentrically over a grassy lawn where no dust column had any business to be. Quickly Thorn moved toward the garage, with the eyes of the amazed guard following him. The scientist was savage at the delay, but it was vital that he rid himself of that clinging dust. Behind the garage he broke off a feathery spray from a vine and struck it lightly over himself. That, too, presented a curious spectacle, a leafy branch suddenly detaching itself from the parent vine and dancing here and there in mid-air. When the all-important task was done, Thorn raced back to the rear doorway. By great good luck it was still open. He stole in, just making it as the truck driver, staggering under a load of empty crates, came up the cellar stairs and went out to his truck. Thorn drew a deep breath. He was inside the Arvanian embassy. The place was a 3-storied stone trap in which, if the slightest slip revealed him to its tenants, he would surely meet his death. But anyway, he was inside, and the threatening Ziegler plans waited somewhere near at hand for him to find and take. Even had Thorn not known in advance that trouble was brewing, he could have surmised that something sinister was being hatched in the Arvanian embassy, for in this big sunny kitchen 5 men lounged about in addition to the white-coated chef and his beardless stripling of an assistant. And each of the 5 had a holster strapped openly over his coat with the butt of an automatic protruding in plain sight. Tom looked about. Across the great range, beside which he was standing and holding his breath for fear some one of the 7 men should become aware of his presence, was the door leading to the front part of the house. He started toward that door, walking on tiptoe. A shudder crept up his spine as he tiptoed across the floor directly in front of the armed guards who would have shot him down without compunction could they have seen him. He was not yet used to his invisibility. Knowing himself to be substantial, feeling his feet descend solidly on the floor, he still could hardly credit the fact that human eyes could not observe him. He got to the door. He put out his hand to open it, then realized just in time that he could not do that. A door stealthily opening and closing again, with no apparent hand to manipulate it, such a spectacle would start a riot. In a frenzy of impatience, he stood beside the door, waiting till someone else should swing it open. And in a moment it chanced that the stripling assistant chef came toward him with a tray. The boy pushed the swinging door with his foot and walked into the butler's pantry. After him, treading almost on the lad's heels, came Thorn. The boy sat the tray down and turned to reach into an upper shelf. The space in the pantry was constricted, and he turned abruptly. The result was that he suddenly drew back as though a hot iron had seared him, and went white as chalk. Then he dashed back into the kitchen. "A hand!" Thorn heard him gibbering in Arvanian. "A hand! I touched it with mine! Something horrible is in there!" With his heart pounding in his throat, Thorn leaned close to the swing door to hear what happened next. Would there be a rush for the butler's pantry? An investigation? He eyed the farther door, the dining room door, but he dared not flee through that save as a last resort. In the dining room sounded voices, and again the sight of a door opening and closing of itself would lead to uproar. "A hand?" he heard one of the guards say in the kitchen. "An unseen hand? Thou art empty in the head, young Gova." There followed some jeering sentences in colloquial Arvanian that were too idiomatic for Thorn's knowledge of the language to let him understand. A general guffaw came from the rest, and as no move was made toward the pantry, Thorn decided he was saved for another few moments. Gasping, he raised his hand to wipe the perspiration off his forehead, then realized there was no perspiration there. His film-clogged pores could exude nothing. He had only the sensation of perspiring. Now the problem was to get through the next door. Thoughtfully, Thorn gazed at it. He saw that this, too, was a swing door. Further, he saw that now and then it creaked open a few inches and swung sluggishly back. Beyond it somewhere, a window was open, and spasmodic gusts moved the swinging slab of wood. The next time the door moved with the wind, Thorn caught it and augmented the movement a bit. Twice he did that, each time swinging it back a trifle further. Next time, he figured, he could open it enough to slide into the room. 2 glimpses he had had with the openings of the door into the room beyond. These glimpses had showed him a great oval table on which was set the debris of afternoon tea, and around which were grouped tense, eager men. Dark of hair and complexion were these men, with the arrogant hawk noses and ruthless small eyes of the typical Arvanian. Several of them were garbed in military uniforms and armed with swords. They were talking in tones too low for Thorn to distinguish words through the film over his ears. He would have to get in there to hear them. For the third time the wind pushed at the door. For the third time Thorn caught its edge and swung it, 6 inches, 8, almost enough to slip through. "Shut thou window!" cracked a voice suddenly. "Fool! What if some of these documents blew away?" There was a slam, and the breeze was cut off. Thorn quickly let go of the door and watched it fall back in place again. He was cursing his luck when he heard the same commanding voice say, "Corey!" See if there be one who listens in the butler's pantry." It seemed the door opened wider than the wind would warrant. There was a scrape of chair. Then the door was abruptly thrust open, and coldly alert eyes in a hostile, wary face swept over the pantry. "No one in here, Excellency," said Corey, and he returned to his place at the table. But with him came another, unseen, to stand against the wall beside a great mahogany buffet and to listen and watch. Corey had, not unnaturally, held the door open while he glanced around the pantry, and under Corey's outstretched arm, so close as almost to brush against his uniformed legs, had stolen Thorn. "Then, gentlemen, it is all arranged," said the man at the head of the oval table, a spare, elderly individual with bristling gray mustachios and smoldering dark eyes. "The plans leave for Arvania tomorrow night, to arrive in our capital city in 10 days. Then day and night manufacture of the Ziegler projectors and declaration of war. Following that, this great city of Washington, and the even greater cities of New York and Chicago, and all this fine land from Atlantic to Pacific shall become an Arvanian possession to exploit as we like." There was an audible "ah" from the score of men around the table, broken by a voice in the main double doorway of the dining room. "Gentlemen, your pardon. I am late." Thorn looked at the speaker. He was a young fellow with an especially elaborate uniform and a face that appeared weak and dissipated in spite of the arrogant Arvanian nose. Then a bark came to Thorn's ears, and a cold feeling to the pit of Thorn's stomach. The newcomer had brought a dog with him. Even as he gazed apprehensively at the dog, a rangy wolfhound, the brute growled deep in its throat and stared at the corner by the buffet where Thorn was instinctively trying to make himself smaller. The dog growled again and stalked warily toward the buffet. "Grego, down," said his master absently. Then to the spare man at the head of the table, "I have been next door, talking to the American Secretary of War, a dull fellow. Convinced is he that Arvanian harbors only kind thoughts for this great stupid nation. They shall be utterly unprepared for our attack. Grego, what ails the brute?" The wolfhound had evaded several outstretched hands and got to the buffet. There it crouched and cowered, fangs showing in a snarl, eyes reddening wickedly, while the growl rattled louder in its shaggy throat. "Perhaps the heat has affected him," said one. All were looking at the dog now, marveling at its odd behavior. But of all the eyes that observed it, a pair of unseen eyes watched with utmost agitation. Thorn stared, almost hypnotized, at the creature. A dog! What rotten luck! Men might be fooled by the masking invisibility, but there was no deceiving a dog's keen nose. The wolfhound started forward as though to leap, then settled back. Plainly it longed to spring. Equally plainly it was afraid of the being that so impossibly was revealed to its nostrils, but not to its eyes. Meanwhile, one tearing sweep of blunt claws or sharp fangs, and a fatal rent would appear in Thorn's encasing shell. The dog snapped tentatively. Thorn flattened still harder against the wall, with discovery and death hovering very close about him. Then the beast's master intervened. "Grego! Here, sir! A council room is no place for thee, anyway. Here, I say! So, then—" He hastened to the dog and caught its collar. Twisting the leather cruelly, he dragged the protesting, snarling brute to the doors and slid them shut, with the wolfhound barking and growling on the outside. "Someone put him in his kennel," he said through the panels. A scuffling in the hall told of the execution of the order. The council room became quiet again, and Thorn leaned against the wall and closed his eyes for an instant. "We were saying, Soyo," the leader addressed the dog's owner, "that the Ziegler plans start for Arvania tomorrow night. All is arranged. These innocent-looking bits of paper," he thumped a small packet of documents lying before him, "shall deliver mighty America to us." A subdued cheer answered the man's words, while Thorn stared at the packet of papers with unbelieving eyes. It had never occurred to him that the Ziegler plans might be in that very room, on the table with the rest of the welter of letters, thumbed documents, and cups and saucers. And there they were, the vital projector plans, not in a safe or hidden in some fantastic place, but right before his eyes. Involuntarily his hand extended eagerly toward the packet, then was withdrawn. Not now. He was invisible, but the papers, if he grasped them, would not be. Clenched in his unseen hand, they would be perfectly visible, moving in jerks and starts as he raced for the door. Like lightning, his mind turned over one plan after another for making away with that precious packet. Each scheme seemed impossible of fulfillment. "The biggest difficulty is in getting them out of the country," the spare elderly man was saying, "but we have solved that. Solved it simply. I myself shall bear them, sewn in my clothes, to our native land. The American authorities could search, on some pretext, any other of our number who tried to smuggle them out, but me they dare not lay a finger on. That would be an overt act." Thorn's thoughts whirled desperately on. Wait till later, and follow whoever left the room with the plans? But he hated to let them get out of his sight. And at this point he became suddenly aware that the man named Corey was gazing fixedly at him. Thorn was between the section of the table where Corey sat and the angular buffet end. Corey could not possibly see anything but the shining mahogany, thought Thorn, and yet the man's eyes were narrowing to ominous slits as he started in his direction. Thorn held his breath. Was the shielding film changing in structure? Were the repolarized atoms slowly losing their straight line arrangement, allowing light rays to penetrate to his body instead of diverting them to form a pocket of invisibility around him? The film had never acted like that before, but never before had Thorn applied it to living flesh, with its disintegrating heat and moisture. "Excellency," said Corey at last, a hard edge to his voice, "look thou at that buffet. No, no, the end nearest my chair." "Well," said the elderly man, "I see nothing." Thorn breathed a sigh of relief, but the relief was to be of short duration. "Come to my place, if thou wilt, and see from here," said Corey. The leader got up and came to Corey's place. Corey pointed straight at Thorn. "There, seest thou anything out of the ordinary?" "I see nothing," said the leader after a moment. "Thine eyes, Corey, are not good." "They are the eyes of a hawk," said Corey stubbornly, "and they see this. The vertical line of the end of that buffet does not continue straightly up and down. At its middle the line is broken, then continues up, a fraction of an inch to the side, like an object seen under water, distorted by the sun rays that strike the surface." Thorn fairly jumped away from the buffet and stood against bare wall. Fool, of course the light refraction would not be perfect. Why hadn't he thought of that? Thought to stand clear of revealing vertical lines. "There, it is gone," said Corey, blinking. "But something, Excellency, made that distortion of line, and something made Soyo's wolfhound act as it did. Something." "Art thou attempting to say a spy listens unseen in this room?" demanded the gray-mustachioed Arvanian. Something is odd, that is all I say. All eyes were ranging along the wall against which Thorn leaned his back. All eyes finally turned to Corey. It is nonsense. I see nothing whatever. Corey has drunk of champagne in place of tea, were some of the exclamations. And then occurred the thing that in Thorn's perilous position was like the self-signing of his own death warrant. He sneezed. That agony of helplessness, as a man's nose wrinkles and twitches and, in spite of the most desperate attempts at repression, the betraying sound forces its way out. How many men have lost their lives because of that insistent, soft nasal explosion, which can be smothered, but not entirely hushed? Thorn had felt the sneeze coming on for seconds. He had fought it frantically, with life itself at stake. But he could not hold it back. In his naked body, beginning to burn with fever from the long clogged pores, and insulated not at all by the film from the coolness of the room, the seeds of that soft explosion had been planted, and they would bear fruit. So he had sneezed. Instantly there was chaos. Men looked at each other, back at the blank wall from which had come the painfully muffled sound. Then all sprang to their feet. "Champagne, is it?" Corey exulted savagely. "Did I not say my eyes were those of a hawk?" "Double guard all doors!" roared the Arvanian leader to the guards outside. "Someone is in the house, and you in here," he went on in a lower tone. "See that this unseen one dies." Soyo and several other men whipped out automatics and pointed them at the wall. Thorn dropped to the floor, but with his quick action came Corey's voice. "No, no, the sword, gentlemen. It is not so noisy and covers a wider sweep." Thorn shivered. Far rather would he have had bullets as his lot than cold steel. The prospect of being hacked to pieces, of gradually emerging from invisibility as a lump of gashed and bleeding flesh, turned him faint. The Arvanians split up into orderly formation. 2 went to guard the door to the butler's pantry, and 2 to cover the closed sliding doors to the outer hall. 6, with drawn swords sweeping back and forth before them, walked slowly toward the wall from which the sneeze had come. Thorn set his jaws, only just catching himself in time to prevent his lips from opening in the half-snarl instinctive to the most civilized men when danger is threatening. That lip motion would have revealed his teeth for an instant. The sensation of perspiring heavily flamed over him again. There were so many trifling things to keep in mind, and each, if neglected, meaning certain death. The nearest of the marching 6 stopped with his foot almost touching Thorn's hand. The dancing sword the men carried almost grazed the scientist's shoulder on its downsweep. Thorn could not stay there. Lying flat along the baseboard, he would be stabbed at any instant by an inquiring sword point. The 6 spread a little, a very little, but there was room enough for Thorn to slide between the 2 men nearest him and roll soundlessly under the table. There was no sanctuary for him there. The cursed Corey, with his hawk eyes, glanced under the table after stabbing vainly along the wall. "The carpet!" he bellowed. "See how the nap is pressed down. He is under there, comrades." The thrusting swords raked under the table a half-second or so after Thorn had rolled out the other side, upsetting a chair in his hurry. "After him!" panted Soyo. "By the living God, this is wizardry, but he must not get away." "He won't," snapped the elderly leader. "Men, form a line at the far end of the room and march slowly, shoulder to shoulder, to this end. The spy must be caught." The move was executed. All the men in the room, save the 4 guarding the doors, lined up and advanced slowly, swerving and slashing their swords. Like a line of workers hand-harvesting a wheat field, they came, foot by foot, toward the corner, where Thorn turned this way and that in a vain effort to escape. The line reached the table. Over and under and around it the swords slashed viciously, leaving no space unprobed. Thorn clenched his fist. He gazed at the packet containing the Ziegler plans. He gazed at the guarded door leading back to the kitchen. Then he tensed himself and leaped. "The plans!" shouted Corey hoarsely. "Look!" The vital packet, as far as the eye could see, had suddenly grown wings, soared from the tabletop, and was floating rapidly, convulsively, toward the door. "Stop him!" yelled Soyo. "Stop!" At that instant the heads of the two who guarded the door were dashed together. The door itself slammed open. The Ziegler plan sped into the butler's pantry. The door to the kitchen began to open just as Corey reached the pantry. An oath burst from the Arvanian's lips. He flung his sword. In the air, shoulder high, appeared suddenly a small fountain of blood. Corey yelled triumphantly. Thorn, feeling the warm drip following the glancing slash in his shoulder, knew the veil of invisibility had at last been rent. Abandoning efforts at noiselessness, knowing that his whereabouts was constantly marked by the packet in his hand anyway, he fled through the kitchen to the rear door. The bolt jerked back, under the astonished eyes of the 5 guards who had not yet realized precisely what the commotion was all about, and who only saw a packet of papers waving in mid-air, a trickle of blood appearing out of nothing, and a bolt banging open its slot for no reason whatever. Thorn's fingers worked feverishly at the chain, but before he could begin to get it undone, the guards had recovered from their surprise and had joined the Arvanians, who poured in from the dining room under Corey's lead. With a score of men crowding the kitchen, Thorn looped back in his tracks like a hunted creature, and sought the cellar door. 4 men he upset, one after another, aided by the fact that his twisting body could be only approximately placed by the papers and the wound. Then Corey's hand swept through the air above the waving packet to clamp over Thorn's wrists. With an effort that bulged the muscles of that blacksmith's forearm of his till it seemed they must burst through the film, Thorn whirled Corey clear off his feet and sent him stumbling into the charge of 3 guards. But in the meantime the cellar was barred to him by a double line of men. Fighting for his life, and far more important, the existence of his country, Thorn lashed out with his invisible right fist while his left clutched the plans. A score of men arrayed in a death struggle against 1. But the odds were not 20 to 1. Not quite. The score could mark Thorn's general whereabouts, but they could not see his flying right fist. This was an invisible weapon that did incredible damage. But if they could not see the fist to guard against it, they could see the results of the fist's impacts. Here a nose suddenly crumpled and an instant later gushed red. There a head was snapped back and up while its owner slowly sagged to the floor. And all the while the still dripping wound and the packet of documents kept with devilish ingenuity between the body of some swordless guard and the impatient blades of the Arvanian nobles. Almost, it seemed to Thorn, he would win free. Almost, it appeared to the Arvanians, the unseen one would reach the big window near the door, which the path of his wreckage indicated was his goal. But one of the wildly swinging fists of a guard caught Thorn at last. It landed on the glass cup over his right eye, cutting a perfect circle in the skin around the eye socket and tearing the film over the glass. Now there were 3 things about the lithe, invisible body that the Arvanians could see: the crumpled papers, a slowly drying patch of blood that moved shoulder high in the air, and a blood-rimmed, ice-gray eye that glared defiance at them from apparently untenanted atmosphere. Then came what seemed must be the end. Soyo appeared in the pantry doorway with a machine gun. "Everybody to the end of the kitchen by the window," he cried. To the devil with silence. We'll spray this room with lead, and let the sound of shots bring what consequences it may. The men scattered. The machine gun muzzle swept toward the place where the eye, the papers, and the blood spot were to be seen. That spot was now at one end of the great kitchen range, on which a few copper pots simmered over white-hot electric burners. At the other end of the range, in the end wall of the kitchen, was a second window. It was small, less than a yard square, and had evidently been punched through the wall as an afterthought to carry off some of the heat of the huge stove. Soyo's face twisted exultantly. The machine gun belched flame. Chasing relentlessly after the dodging, shifting blood spot, a line of holes appeared in the wall, following instantly on the tap-tap-tap of the gun. Eye and papers and blood spot appeared to float through the air. One of the copper pots on the range flew off onto the floor. The glass of the small ventilating window smashed to bits. In the jagged frame its broken edges presented, the Arvanian saw for a flashing instant the seared, blistered soles of a pair of human feet. "Outside!" bawled Corey. "He jumped onto the range and dove through the window. After him!" After precious seconds had been wasted, the rear door was unchained and wrenched open. The Arvanians, swords and guns drawn, raced out to the rear yard. His Excellency's town car, that had been standing in front of the open garage doors, leaped into life. With motor roaring wide open, it tore toward the Arvanians, some of whom leaped aside and some of whom were hurled to right and left by the heavy fenders. Startled people on 16th Street saw a great town car swaying down the asphalt, seemingly guided by no hand other than that of fate. Some said afterward they saw a single eye gleaming through the windshield, but no one believed that. Equally startled people saw the car screech to a stop in front of the home of the Secretary of War. After it, scarcely a full minute later, 3 motors with the Arvanian coat of arms on them came to a halt. "My dear fellow," said the Secretary blandly to the livid Arvanian ambassador, "no one has come in here with papers or anything else. I saw a man jump out of your town car and run south on Connecticut Avenue. That's all I know." "But I tell you!" shrieked the Arvanian. He stopped, impaled on the Secretary's icy cold glance. "Your story is rather incredible," murmured the Secretary. "Valuable plans stolen from your embassy by an invisible man? Come, come." Dark Arvanian eyes glared into light American ones. "By the way," said the Secretary affably, "I am thinking of giving a semi-official banquet to celebrate future friendly relations between our two countries. Do you approve?" The Arvanian ambassador tugged at his collar to straighten it. World dominion had been in his fingers, and had slipped through. But he would not have been a diplomat had he let his face continue to express the bitterness in his heart. "I think such a banquet would be a splendid idea," he said suavely. End of The Radiant Shell. This recording is in the public domain.
A Scientist Rises. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dennis Dawson. A Scientist Rises by D.W. Hall. The face of the giant was indeed that of a god. On that summer day, the sky over New York was unflecked by clouds, and the air hung motionless, the waves of heat undisturbed. The city was a vast oven, where even the sounds of the coiling traffic in its streets seemed heavy and weary under the press of heat that poured down from above. In Washington Square, the urchins of the neighborhood splashed in the fountain, and the usual midday assortment of mothers, tramps, and out-of-works lounged listlessly on the hot park benches. As a bowl, the square was filled by the torrid sun, and the trees and grass drooped like the people on its walks. In the surrounding city, men worked in sweltering offices, and the streets rumbled with the never-ceasing tide of business. But Washington Square rested. And then a man walked out of one of the houses lining the square, and all this was changed. He came with a calm, steady stride down the steps of a house on the north side, and those who happened to see him gazed with surprised interest, for he was a giant in size. He measured at least 11 feet in height, and his body was well formed and in perfect proportion. He crossed the street and stepped over the railing into the nearest patch of grass, and there stood with his arms folded and legs a little apart. The expression on his face was preoccupied and strangely apart, nor did it change when almost immediately from the park bench nearest him a woman's excited voice cried, "Look! Look! Oh, look!" The people around her craned their necks and stared, and from them grew a startled murmur. Others from farther away came to see who had cried out, and remained to gaze, fascinated at the man on the grass. Quickly the murmur spread across the square, and from its every part men and women and children streamed toward the center of interest, and then, when they saw, backed away slowly and fearfully, with staring eyes from where the lone figure stood. There was about that figure something uncanny and terrible. There in the hot midday hush, something was happening to it which men would say could not happen, and men seeing it backed away in alarm. Quickly they dispersed. Soon there were only white, frightened faces peering from behind buildings and trees. Before their very eyes the giant was growing. When he had first emerged, he had been around 11 feet tall, and now, within 3 minutes, he had risen close to 16 feet. His great body maintained its perfect proportions. It was that of an elderly man, clad simply in a gray business suit. The face was kind, the clear, chiseled features indicating fine spiritual strength. On the white forehead, beneath the sparse gray hair, were deep sunken lines which spoke of years of concentrated work. No thought of malevolence could come from that head with its gentle blue eyes that showed the peace within, but fear struck ever stronger into those who watched him, and in one place a woman fainted, for the great body continued to grow, and grow even faster, until it was 20 feet high, then swiftly 25, and the feet, still separated, were as long as the body of a normal boy. Clothes and body grew effortlessly, the latter apparently without pain, as if the terrifying process were wholly natural. The cars coming into Washington Square had stopped as their drivers sighted what was rising there, and by now the bordering streets were tangled with traffic. A distant crowd of milling people heightened the turmoil. The northern edge was deserted, but in a large semicircle was spread a fear-struck, panicking mob. A single policeman, his face white and his eyes wide, tried to straighten out the tangle of vehicles, but it was infinitely beyond him, and he sent in a riot call. And as the giant with the kind, dignified face loomed silently higher than the trees in the square, and even higher, a dozen blue-coated figures appeared and saw, and knew fear too, and hung back awe-stricken, at a loss what to do, for by now the rapidly mounting body had risen to the height of 40 feet. An excited voice raised itself above the general hubbub. "Why, I know him! I know him! It's Edgar Wesley! Dr. Edgar Wesley!" A police sergeant turned to the man who had spoken. "And he knows you? Then go closer to him and ask him what it means." But the man looked fearfully at the giant and hung back. Even as they talked, his gigantic body had grown as high as the 4-storied buildings lining the square, and his feet were becoming too large for the place where they had first been put. And now a faint smile could be seen on the giant's face, an enigmatic smile with something ironic and bitter in it. "Then shout to him from here," pressed the sergeant nervously. "We've got to find out something. This is crazy, impossible. My God, higher yet and faster! Summoning his courage, the other man cupped his hands about his mouth and shouted, "Dr. Wesley! Can you speak and tell us? Can we help you stop it?" The ring of people looked up breathless at the towering figure, and a wave of fear passed over them. Several hysterical shrieks rose up as, very slowly, the huge head shook from side to side. But the smile on its lips became stronger and kinder, and the bitterness seemed to leave it. There was fear at that motion of the enormous head, but a roar of panic sounded from the watchers when, with marked caution, the growing giant moved 1 foot from the grass into the street behind, and the other into the nearby base of Fifth Avenue, just above the arch. Fearing harm, they were gripped by terror, and they fought back while the trembling policemen tried vainly to control them. But the panic soon ended when they saw that the Leviathan's arms remained crossed, and his smile kinder yet. By now he dwarfed the houses, his body looming 150 feet into the sky. At this moment a woman back of the semicircle slumped to her knees and prayed hysterically. "Someone's coming out of his house!" shouted one of the closest onlookers. The door of the house from which the giant had first appeared had opened, and the figure of a middle-aged, normal-sized man emerged. For a second he crouched on the steps, gaping up at the monstrous shape in the sky, and then he scurried down and made at a desperate run for the nearest group of policemen. He gripped the sergeant and cried frantically, "That's Dr. Wesley! Why don't you do something? Why don't—" "Who are you?" the officer asked, with some return of an authoritative manner. "I work for him. I'm his janitor. But can't you do anything? Look at him! Look!" The crowd pressed closer. "What do you know about this?" went on the sergeant. The man gulped and stared around wildly. "He's been working on something many years. I don't know what, for he kept it a close secret. All I knew is that an hour ago I was in my room upstairs when I heard some disturbance in his laboratory on the ground floor. I came down and knocked on the door, and he answered from inside and said that everything was all right." "You didn't go in?" "No, I went back up, and everything was quiet for a long time. Then I heard a lot of noise down below, a smashing, as if things were being broken. But I thought he was just destroying something he didn't need, and I didn't investigate. He hated to be disturbed. And then, a little later, I heard them shouting out here in the square, and I looked out and I saw him, just as I knew him, but a giant. Look at his face. Why, he has the face of a god. He's as if he were looking down on us and pitying us." For a moment all were silent as they gazed, transfixed, at the vast form that towered 200 feet above them. Almost as awe-inspiring as the astounding growth was the fine, dignified calmness of the face. The sergeant broke in. "The explanation of this must be in his laboratory. We've got to have a look. You lead us there." The other man nodded, but just then the giant moved again, and they waited and watched. With the utmost caution, the titanic shape changed position. Gradually, one great foot, over 30 feet in length, soared up from the street and lowered farther away, and then the other distant foot changed its position, and the Leviathan came gently to rest against the tallest building bordering the square, and once more folded his arms and stood quiet. The enormous body appeared to waver slightly as a breath of wind washed against it. Obviously it was not gaining weight as it grew. Almost now it appeared to float in the air. Swiftly it grew another 25 feet, and the gray expanse of its clothes shimmered strangely as a ripple ran over its colossal bulk. A change of feeling came gradually over the watching multitude. The face of the giant was indeed that of a god in the noble, irony-tinged serenity of his calm features. It was as if a further world had opened, and one of divinity had stepped down, a further world of kindness and fellow-love, where were none of the discords that bring conflicts and slaughterings to the weary people of earth. Spiritual peace radiated from the enormous face under the silvery hair. peace with an undertone of sadness, as if the giant knew of the sorrows of the swarm of dwarves beneath him, and pitied them. From all the roofs and the towers of the city, for miles and miles around, men saw the mammoth shape and the kindly smile grow more and more tenuous against the clear blue sky. The figure remained quietly in the same position, his feet filling 2 empty streets, and under the spell of his smile all fear seemed to leave the nearer watchers, and they became more quiet and controlled. The group of policemen and the janitor made a dash for the house from which the giant had come. They ascended the steps, went in, and found the door of the laboratory locked. They broke the door down. The sergeant looked in. "Anyone in here?" he cried. Nothing disturbed the silence, and he entered, the others following. A long, wide, dimly lit room met their eyes, and in its middle the remains of a great mass of apparatus that had dominated it. The apparatus was now completely destroyed. Its dozen rows of tubes were shattered, its intricate coils of wire and machinery hopelessly smashed. Fragments lay scattered all over the floor. No longer was there the least shape of meaning to anything in the room. There remained merely a litter of glass and stone and scrap metal. Conspicuous on the floor was a large hammer. The sergeant walked over to pick it up, but instead paused and stared at what lay beyond it. "A body," he said. A sprawled-out dead man lay on the floor, his dark face twisted up, his sightless eyes staring at the ceiling, his temple crushed as with a hammer. Clutched tight in one stiff hand was an automatic. On his chest was a sheet of paper. The captain reached down and grasped the paper. He read what was written on it, and then he read it to the others. "There was a fool who dreamed the high dream of the pure scientist, and who lived only to ferret out the secrets of nature, and harness them for his fellow man. He studied and worked and thought, and in time came to concentrate on the manipulation of the atom, especially the possibility of contracting and expanding it, a thing of greatest potential value. For 9 years he worked along this line, hoping to succeed and give new power, new happiness, a new horizon to mankind. Hermetically sealed in his laboratory, self-exiled from human contacts, he labored hard. There came a day when the device into which the fool had poured his life stood completed and a success. And on that very day an agent for a certain government entered his laboratory to steal the device. And in that moment the fool realized what he had done, that from the apparatus he had invented not happiness and new freedom would come to his fellow men, but instead slaughter and carnage, and drunken power increased 100-fold. He realized suddenly that man had not yet learned to use fruitfully the precious, powerful things given to them, but as yet could only play with them like greedy children, and kill as they played. Already his invention had brought death, and he realized, even on this day of his triumph, that it and its secret must be destroyed, and with them he who had fashioned so blindly. For the scientist was old. His whole life was the invention, and with its going there would be nothing more. And so he used the device's great powers on his own body, and then with those powers working on him, he destroyed the device and all the papers that held its secrets. Was the fool also mad? Perhaps, but I do not think so. Into his lonely laboratory with this marauder had come the wisdom that men must wait, that the time is not yet for such power as he was about to offer. A gesture, his strange death, which you who read this have seen? Yes, but a useful one, for with it he and his invention and its hurtful secrets go from you, and a fitting one, for he dies through his achievement, through his very life. But in a better sense he will not die, for the power of his achievement will dissolve his very body among you infinitely. You will breathe him in your air, and in you he will live incarnate until a later time when another will give you the knowledge he now destroys, and he will see it used as he wished it used. E.W. The sergeant's voice ceased, and wordlessly the men in the laboratory looked at each other. No comment was needed. They went out. They watched from the steps of Edgar Wesley's house. At first sight of the figure in the sky, a new awe struck them, for now the shape of the giant towered a full 500 feet into the sun, and it seemed almost a mirage, for definite outline was gone from it. It shimmered and wavered against the bright blue like a mist, and the blue shone through it, for it was quite transparent. And yet still they imagined they could discern the slight, ironic smile on the face, and the peaceful, understanding light in the serene eyes, and their hearts swelled at the knowledge of the spirit, of the courage, of the fine, far-seeing mind of that outflung titanic martyr to the happiness of men. The end came quickly. The great misty body rose. It floated over the city like a wraith, and then it swiftly dispersed, even as steam dissolves in the air. They felt a silence over the thousands of watching people in the square, a hush broken at last by a deep, low murmur of awe and wonderment as the final misty fragments of the vast, sky-held figure wavered and melted imperceptibly, melted, and were gone from sight in the air that was breathed by the men whom Edgar Wesley loved. End of A Scientist Rises by D.W. Hall. Recording by Dennis Dawson, Cupertino, California. www.epcomm.com/ddawson.
Point by C.C. Beck. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Vanishing Point by C.C. Beck. Quote, in perspective, theoretically, the vanishing point is at infinity and therefore unattainable. But reality is different. Vanishment occurs a lot sooner than theory suggests. That? Oh, that's a perspective machine. Well, not exactly, but that's what I call it. No, I don't know how it works. Too complicated for me. Carter could make it a go, but after he made it, he never used it. Too bad. He thought he'd make a lot of money with it there for a while he was working it out. Almost had me convinced, but I told him, get it to working first, Carter, and then show me what you can do with it better than I can do it without it. I'm doing pretty well as is. Pictures selling good, even if I do make 'em all by guesswork, as you call it. That's what I told him. You see, Carter was one of them artists that think they can work everything out by formulas and stuff. Me, I just paint things as I see 'em. Never worry about perspective and all that kind of mechanical aids. Never even went to art school. But I do all right. Carter, now, was a different sort of artist. Well, he wasn't really an artist, more of a draftsman. I first got him in to help me with a series of real estate paintings I'd got an order for. Big aerial views of land developments and drawings of buildings, roads, and causeways, that kind of stuff. It was a little too much for me to handle alone, because I never studied that kind of things. You know. I thought he'd do the mechanical drawings, which should have been simple for anybody trained that way, and I'd throw in the colors, figures, and trees, and so on. He did fine. Job came out good. Client was real happy. We made a pretty good amount on the job. Enough to keep us for a couple of months without working afterwards. I took it easy, fishing, and so on. But Carter stayed here in the studio working on his own stuff. I let him keep an eye on things for me around the place and just dropped in now and then to check up. The guy was nuts on the subject of perspective. I thought he knew all there was to know about it already, but he claimed nobody knew anything about it, really. Said he'd been studying it for years, and the more he learned about it, the more there was to learn. He used to cover big sheets of paper with complicated diagrams trying to prove something or other to himself. I come into the studio and find him with thumbtacks and strings and stuff all over the place. He'd get big long rulers and draw lines to various points all over the room and end up with a little drawing of a cube about an inch square that anybody could have made in half a minute without all the apparatus. Seemed pretty silly to me. Then he brought in some books on mathematics and physics and other things, and a bunch of slide rules, calculators, and junk. He must have been a pretty smart guy to know how to handle all those things, even if he was kind of dopey about other things. You know, women and fishing and sports and drinking. He was lousy at everything except working those perspective problems. Personally, I couldn't see much sense to what he was doing. The guy could draw all right already, so I asked him what more did he want. Let me see if I can remember what he said. I'm trying to get at things as they really are, not as they appear, he said. I think those were his words. Art is an illusion, a bag of tricks. Reality is something else, not what we think it is. Drawings are two-dimensional projections of a world that is not merely three, but four-dimensional, if not more, he said. Yeah, kind of a crackpot, Carter was. Just on that one subject, though. Nice enough guy otherwise. Here, look at some of the drawings he made, working out his formulas. Nice designs, huh? Might make good wallpaper or fabric patterns. Real abstract. That's what people seem to like. See all those little letters scattered around among the lines? Different kinds of vanishing points they are. Carter claimed the whole world was full of vanishing points. You don't know what a vanishing point is? Let me see if I can explain. Come over to the window here. You see how that road out there gets smaller and smaller in the distance? Of course, the road doesn't really get smaller. It just looks that way. That's what we call a vanishing point in drawing. Simple, isn't it? Never could understand why Carter went to so much trouble working out all those ways to locate vanishing points. Me, I just throw 'em in wherever I need 'em. But Carter claimed that was wrong. Said they were all connected together some way, and he was going to work out a method to prove it. Here's a little gadget he made up to help his calculations. Bunch of discs all pivoted together at the center. You're supposed to turn around so the arrows point to the different figures and things. Here's the square root sign. I remember Carter telling me that. This one is the tangent function, whatever that means. Log, there, is short for logarithm. Oh, he had a bunch of that scientific stuff in his head all the time. To know whether he understood it all himself. He built this thing just before he put together the perspective machine there. Silly looking gadget, huh? All them pipes and wires and that little cube in the center. Don't try to touch it. It ain't really there. You just think it is. It's what Carter called a teteract. Or a cataract. No, that ain't the right word. Something like that. Tesser something or other. There's a picture like it in one of Carter's books. Hurt your eyes to look at it, don't it? That's what Carter thought was going to make him a lot of fame and money, that perspective machine. I told him nobody'd ever make a drawing machine yet that worked. But he said it wasn't supposed to make drawings. It was just supposed to give people a view of what reality really is, instead of what they think it is. I don't know whether he expected to charge money to look through it, or whether he was going to look through it himself and make some new kind of drawings and sell them. No, I can't tell you how it works. I said before I don't know. Carter only used it once himself. I came in here the day he finished it, just as he was ready to turn it on. He was just putting the finishing touches on it. In a few minutes, he told me, I'll have the answer to a question that may never have been answered before. What is reality? Is the world a thing by itself, and all we know illusion? Why do things grow smaller the farther away from us they appear? Why can't we see more than one side of anything at a time? What happens to the far side of an object? Does it cease to exist just because we can't see it? Are objects not present, non-existent? Because artists draw things, vanishing to points, does that mean they really vanish? A whack. That's what he was. Nice guy, but sort of screwy. He kept saying more goofy things while he was finishing up the machine, about how he'd figured out that all we knew about vision and drawing and so on must be wrong, and that once he got a look at the real world, he'd prove it. How about cameras? I asked him. Take a picture with a camera, and it looks just about the same as a drawing, don't it? That's because cameras are built to take pictures like we're used to seeing them, he said. Flat two-dimensional slices of reality without depth or motion. Even 3D moving pictures? I asked. They're closer to reality, he admitted, but they are still only cross-sections of it. The shutter of a movie camera is closed as much of the time as it's open. What happens in between the times it's open? You know, he went on, people used to think matter and motion were continuous, but scientists have proved that they are discontinuous. Now, some of them think that time may be too. Maybe everything is just imaginary and appears to our senses in whatever way we want it to appear. We are so well trained that we see everything just as we are taught to see it by generations of artists, writers, and other symbol makers. If we could see things as they really are, what might happen? We'd probably all go nuts, I told him. He just smiled. Well, here goes, he said. It's finished. Now to find out who was right, the scientists and philosophers who say reality is forever unreachable, or the artists who say there isn't any reality, that we make the whole thing up to suit ourselves. He moved one of those pointers you see there and squinted around at the different scales and dials, and then stepped back. That little Tessie thing appeared, real small at first. Just a point. You could hardly see it. I couldn't see anything else happening, and thought he was going to do something else to the machine. I turned to look at Carter, and saw his face was white as a sheet. Good God, he says, just like that. Good God! That's all. Well, I says to him, who was right, the scientists or the artists? The artists! He sort of screeches. The artists were right all the time. There is no reality. It's all a fabric of illusion we've created ourselves. And now I've ripped a hole in that. He gives a strangled hoot and goes hightailing out of here like something was after him. Jumps in his car and roars off down the road and disappears. Nah, I don't mean he really disappeared. Are you nuts? Just roared on down the road till he got so small I couldn't see him no more. You know, the way things do when they go farther and farther away happens every day. That's what us artists mean by perspective. The machine? Well, I don't know what to do with it. If Carter ever comes back, he might not like my getting rid of it. I was thinking maybe I'd put it in the hobby show at the county fair next week, though. You notice how that funny-looking cube inside there gets bigger every time you look at it? There, it just doubled its size again, see? People at the fair ought to get a big kick out of that. No telling how big it'll get with all those people looking at it. But come on, let's go fishing. We better hurry, or it'll be too late. End of The Vanishing Point. Read by Bologna Times for JWP and Tom.
Viewpoint. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Ray Smith. Viewpoint by Randall Garrett. A fearsome thing is a thing you're afraid of, and it has nothing whatever to do with whatever others are afraid, nor with whether it is in fact dangerous. It's your view of the matter that counts. There was a dizzy, sickening whirl of metal blackness. Not true blackness, but a mind-enveloping darkness that was filled with the multicolored little sparks of thoughts and memories that scattered through the darkness like tiny glowing mice, fleeing from something unknown, fleeing outward and away toward a somewhere that was equally unknown, scurrying, moving, changing, each half recognizable as it passed, but leaving only a vague impression behind. Memories were scattered into their component data bits in that maelstrom of not-quite darkness, and scattered throughout infinity and eternity. Then the pseudo-dark stopped its violent motion and became still, no longer scattering the fleeing memories, but merely blanketing them. And slowly, ever so slowly, the powerful, cohesive forces that existed between the data bits began pulling them back together again as the not-blackness faded. The associative powers of the mind began putting the frightened little things together as they drifted back in from vast distances, trying to fit them together again in an ordered whole. Like a vast jigsaw puzzle in 5 dimensions, little clots and patches formed as the bits were snuggled into place here and there. The process was far from complete when Broom regained consciousness. Broom sat up abruptly and looked around him. The room was totally unfamiliar. For a moment that seemed perfectly understandable. Why shouldn't the room look odd after he had gone through? What? He rubbed his head and looked around more carefully. It was not just that the room itself was unfamiliar as a whole. The effect was greater than that. It was not the first time in his life that he had regained consciousness in unfamiliar surroundings, but always before he had been aware that only the pattern was different, not the details. He sat there on the floor and took stock of himself and his surroundings. He was a big man, 6 feet tall when he stood up, and proportionately heavy, a big-boned frame covered with hard, well-trained muscles. His hair and beard were a dark blonde and rather shaggy because of the time he'd spent in prison. Prison? Yes, he'd been in prison. The rough clothing he was wearing was certainly nothing like the type of dress he was used to. He tried to force his memory to give him the information he was looking for, but it wouldn't come. A face flickered in his mind for a moment, and a name. Contarini. He seemed to remember a startled look on the Italian's face, but he could neither remember the reason for it, nor when it had been. But it would come back, he was sure of that. Meanwhile, where the devil was he? From where he was sitting, he could see that the room was fairly large, but not extraordinarily so. A door in one wall led into another room about the same size, but they were like no other rooms he had ever seen before. He looked down at the floor. It was soft, almost as soft as a bed, covered with a thick, even, resilient layer of fine material of some kind. It was some sort of carpeting that covered the floor from wall to wall, but no carpet had ever felt like this. He lifted himself gingerly to his feet. He wasn't hurt, at least. He felt fine, except for the gaps in his memory. The room was well lit. The illumination came from the ceiling, which seemed to be made of some glowing, semi-transparent metal that cast a shadowless glow over everything. There was a large, bulky table near the wall, away from the door. It looked almost normal, except that the objects on it were like nothing that had ever existed. Their purposes were unknown, and their shapes meaningless. He jerked his head away, not wanting to look at the things on the table. The walls at least looked familiar. They seemed to be paneled in some fine wood. He walked over and touched it, and knew immediately that no matter what it looked like, it wasn't wood. The illusion was there to the eye, but no wood ever had such a hard, smooth, glass-like surface as this. He jerked his fingertips away. He recognized then the emotion that had made him turn away from the objects on the table and pull his hand away from the unnatural wall. It was fear. Fear? Nonsense! He put his hand out suddenly and slapped the wall with his palm and held it there. There was nothing to be afraid of. He laughed at himself softly. He'd faced death 100 times during the war without showing fear. This was no time to start. What would his men think of him if they saw him getting shaky over the mere touch of a wood-like wall? The memories were coming back. This time he didn't try to probe for them. He just let them flow. He turned around again and looked deliberately at the big, bulky table. There was a faint humming noise coming from it which had escaped his notice before. He walked over to it and looked at the queerly shaped thing that lay on its shining surface. He had already decided that the table was no more wood than the wall, and a touch of a finger to the surface verified the decision. The only thing that looked at all familiar on the table was a sheaf of written paper. He picked it up and, glancing over the pages, noticed the neat characters, so unlike any that he knew. He couldn't read a word of it. He grinned and put the sheets back down on the smooth tabletop. The humming appeared to be coming from a metal box on the other side of the table. He circled around and took a look at the thing. It had levers and knobs and other projections, but their functions were not immediately discernible. There were several rows of studs with various unrecognizable symbols on them. This would certainly be something to tell in London, when and if he ever got back. He reached out a tentative finger and touched one of the symbol-marked studs. There was a loud click in the stillness of the room, and he leaped back from the device. He watched it warily for a moment, but nothing more seemed to be forthcoming. Still, he decided it might be best to let things alone. There was no point in messing with things that undoubtedly controlled forces beyond his ability to cope with, or understand. After all, such a long time. He stopped. Time? Time? What had Contarini said about time? Something about it being like a river that flowed rapidly. That much he remembered. Oh yes, and that it was almost impossible to try to swim backwards against the current, or something else. What? He shook his head. The more he tried to remember what his fellow prisoner had told him, the more elusive it became. He had traveled in time, that much was certain. But how far, and in which direction? Toward the future, obviously. Contarini had made it plain that going into the past was impossible. Then could he, Broom, get back to his own time? Or was he destined to stay in this place, wherever and whenever it was? Evidently, movement through the time river had a tendency to disorganize a man's memories. Well, wasn't that obvious anyway? Even normal movement through time at the rate of a day per day made some memories fade, and some were lost entirely, while others remained clear and bright. What would a sudden jump of centuries do? His memory was improving, though. If he just let it alone, most of it would come back, and he could orientate himself. Meanwhile, he might as well explore his surroundings a little more. He resolved to keep his hands off anything that wasn't readily identifiable. There was a single oddly shaped chair by the bulky table, and behind the chair was a heavy curtain which apparently covered a window. He could see the gleam of light coming through the division in the curtains. Broom decided he might as well get a good look at whatever was outside the building he was in. He stepped over, parted the curtains, and gasped. It was nighttime outside, and the sky was clear. He recognized the familiar constellations up there, but they were dimmed by the light from the city that stretched below him. And what a city! At first it was difficult for his eyes to convey their impressions intelligently to his brain. What they were recording was so unfamiliar that his brain could not decode the messages they sent. There was broad, well-lit streets that stretched on and on, as far as he could see, and beyond them flittering ferry bridges rose into the air and arched into the distance, and the buildings towered over everything. He forced himself to look down, and it made him dizzy. The building he was in was so high that it would have projected through the clouds, if there had been any clouds. Broom backed away from the window and let the curtain close. He had all he could take for right now. The inside of the building, his immediate surroundings, looked almost homey after seeing the monstrous, endless city outside. He skirted the table with its still humming machine and walked toward the door that led to the other room. A picture hanging on a nearby wall caught his eye, and he stopped. It was a portrait of a man in unfamiliar outlandish clothing, but Broom had seen odder clothing in his travels. But the thing that had stopped him was the amazing reality of the picture. It was almost as if there were a mirror there, reflecting the face of a man who stood invisibly before him. It wasn't, of course. It was only a painting, but the lifelike, somber eyes of the man were focused directly on him. Broom decided that he didn't like the effect at all, and hurried into the next room. There were several rows of the bulky tables in there, each with its own chair. Broom's footsteps sounded loud in the room, the echoes rebounding from the walls. He stopped and looked down. This floor wasn't covered with a soft carpeting. It was a square mosaic pattern, as though it might be composed of tile of some kind. And yet, though it was harder than the carpet, it had kind of a queer resiliency of its own. The room itself was larger than the one he had just quitted, and not as well lit. For the first time he thought of the possibility that there might be someone else here beside himself. He looked around, wishing that he had a weapon of some kind. Even a knife would have made him feel better. But there had been no chance of that, of course. Prisoners of war are hardly allowed to carry weapons with them, so none had been available. He wondered what sort of men lived in this fantastic city. So far he had seen no one. The streets below had been filled with moving vehicles of some kind, but it had been difficult to tell whether there had been anyone walking down there from this height. Contarini had said that it would be... How had he said it? Like sleeping for hundreds of years and waking up in a strange world. Well, it was that all right. Did anyone know he was here? He had the uneasy feeling that hidden, unseen eyes were watching his every move, and yet he could detect nothing. There was no sound except the faint humming from the device in the room behind him, and a deeper, almost inaudible rushing, rumbling sound that seemed to come from far below. His wish for a weapon came back stronger than before. The very fact that he had seen no one sent his nerves on edge even more than the sight of a known enemy would have done. He was suddenly no longer interested in his surroundings. He felt trapped in this strange, silent room. He could see a light shining through a door in the far end of the room. Perhaps it was a way out. He walked toward it, trying to keep his footsteps as silent as possible as he moved. The door had a pane of translucent glass in it, and there were more of the unreadable characters on it. He wished fervently that he could decipher them. They might tell him where he was. Carefully he grasped the handle of the door, twisted it, and pulled. And carefully as he had been, the door swung inward with surprising rapidity. It was a great deal thinner and lighter than he had supposed. He looked down at it, wondering if there was any way the door could be locked. There was a tiny vertical stud set in the small metal panel in the door, but it was much too tiny to be a keyhole. Still, it didn't matter. If necessary, he could smash the glass to get through the door. He stepped out into what was obviously a hallway beyond the door. The hallway stretched away to either side, lined with doors similar to the one he had just come through. How did a man get out of this place, anyway? The door behind him was pressed against his hand with patient insistence, as though it wanted to close itself. He almost let it close, but at the last second he changed his mind. Better the devil we know than the devil we don't, he thought to himself. He went back into the office and looked around for something to prop the door open. He found a small, beautifully formed porcelain dish on one of the desks, picked it up, and went back to the door. The dish held the door open an inch or so. That was good enough. If someone locked the door, he could still smash the door if he wanted to, but the absence of the dish when he returned would tell him that he was not alone in the mysterious place. He started down the hallway to his right, checking the doors as he went. They were all locked. He knew that he could break into any of them, but he had a feeling that he would find no exit through any of them. They all looked as though they concealed more of the big rooms. None of them had any lights behind them. Only the one door that he had come through showed the telltale glow from the other side. Why? He had the terrible feeling that he had been drawn across time to this place for a purpose, and that he could think of no rational reason for believing so. He stopped as another memory came back. He remembered being in the stone-walled dungeon, with its smelly straw beds, lit only by the faint shaft of sunlight that came from the barred windows high overhead. Contarini, the short, wiry little Italian who was in the next cell, looked at him through the narrow opening. "I still think it can be done, my friend. It is the mind and the mind alone that sees the flow of time. The body experiences, but does not see. Only the soul is capable of knowing eternity." Broom outranked the little Italian, but prison can make brothers of all men. You think it's possible, then, to get out of a place like this simply by thinking about it? Contarini nodded. Why not? Did not the saints do so? And what was that? Contemplation of the eternal, my comrade. Contemplation of the eternal. Broom held back a grin. Then why, my Venetian friend, have you not left this place long since? I try, Contarini had said simply, but I cannot do it. You wish to know why? It is because I'm afraid. Afraid? Broom raised an eyebrow. He had seen Contarini on the battlefield dealing death in hand-to-hand combat, and the Italian hadn't impressed him as a coward. Yes, said the Venetian. Afraid. Oh, I am not afraid of men. I fight. Some day I may die. Will die. This does not frighten me, death. I am not afraid of what men may do to me." He stopped and frowned. "But of this I have a great fear. Only a saint can handle such things, and I am no saint." "I hope, my dear Contarini," Broom said dryly, "that you are not under the impression that I am a saint." "No, perhaps not," Contarini said. "Perhaps not. But you are braver than I. I am not afraid of any man living. But you are afraid of neither the living nor the dead, nor of man or evil, which is a great deal more than I can say for myself. Besides, there is blood of kings in your veins. And has not a king protection that even a man of noble birth such as yourself does not have? I think so. Oh, I have no doubt that you could do it, if you but would. And then perhaps when you are free you would free me, for teaching you all that I know to accomplish this. My fear holds me chained here, but you have no chains of fear." Broom had thought that over for a moment, then grinned. "All right, my friend. I'll try it. What's your first lesson?" The memory faded from Broom's mind. Had he really moved through some segment of eternity to reach this place? Had he? He felt a chill run through him. What was he doing here? How could he have taken it all so calmly? Afraid of man or devil? No. But this was neither. He had to get back. The utter alienness of this bright, shining, lifeless wonderland was too much for him. Instinctively he turned and ran back toward the room he had left. If he got back to the place where he had appeared in this world, perhaps somehow some force would return him to where he belonged. The door was as he had left it, the porcelain dish still in place. He scooped up the dish in one big hand and ran on into the room, letting the door shut itself behind him. He ran on, through the large room with its many tables, into the brightly lighted room beyond. He stopped. What could he do now? He tried to remember the things that the Italian had told him to do, and he could not for the life of him remember them. His memory still had gaps in it, gaps he did not know were there because he had not yet probed for them. He closed his eyes in concentration, trying to bring back a memory that would not come. He did not hear the intruder until the man's voice echoed in the room. Broom's eyes opened, and instantly every muscle and nerve in his hard-trained body tensed for action. There was a man standing in the doorway of the office. He was not a particularly impressive man, in spite of the queer cut of his clothes. He was not as tall as Broom, and he looked soft and overfed. His paunch protruded roundly from the open front of the short coat, and there was a fleshiness about his face that betrayed too much good living. And he looked even more frightened than Broom had been a few minutes before. He was saying something in a language that Broom did not understand, and the tenseness in his voice betrayed his fear. Broom relaxed. He had nothing to fear from this little man. "I won't hurt you," Broom said. "I have no intention of intruding on your property, but all I ask is help." The little man was blinking and backing away as though he was going to turn and bolt at any moment. Broom laughed. "You have nothing to fear from me, little man. Permit me to introduce myself. I am Richard Broom, known as—" He stopped, and his eyes widened. Total memory flooded over him as he realized fully who he was and where he belonged. And the fear hit him again in a raging flood, sweeping over his mind and blotting it out. Again the darkness came. This time the blackness faded quickly. There was a face, a worried face, looking at him through an aperture of the stone wall. The surroundings were so familiar that the bit of memories that had been scattered again during the passage through centuries of time came back more quickly and settled back into their accustomed pattern more easily. The face was that of the Italian Contarini. He was looking both worried and disappointed. "You were not gone long, my Lord King," he said, "but you were gone. Of that there can be no doubt. Why did you return?" Richard Broom sat up on his pallet of straw. The scene in the strange building already seemed dreamlike, but the fear was still there. "I couldn't remember," he said softly. "I couldn't remember who I was, nor why I had gone to that place. And when I remembered, I came back." Contarini nodded sadly. "It is as I have heard. The memory ties one too strongly to the past, to one's own time. One must return as soon as the mind had digested. I am sorry, my friend. I had hoped we could escape. But now it appears that we must wait until our ransoms are paid, and I much fear that mine will never be paid." "Nor mine," said the big man dully. "My faithful Blondin found me, but he may not have returned to London, and even if he has, my brother John may be reluctant to raise the money. What? Would England hesitate to ransom the brave king who had fought so gallantly in the Holy Crusades? Never! You will be free, my friend. But Richard Plantagenet just stared at the little dish that he still held in his hand, the fear still in his heart. Men would still call him lion-hearted, but he knew that he would never again deserve the title. And nearly 8 centuries away in time, and thousands of miles away in space, a Mr. Edward Jasperson was speaking hurriedly into the telephone that stood by the electric typewriter on his desk. "That's right, officer. Suite 8601, Empire State Building. I was working late, and I left the light on in my office when I came out to get a cup of coffee. When I came back, he was there, a big bearded man, wearing a thing that looked like a monk's robe made out of gunny sack. What? No, I locked the door when I left. What? Well, the only thing that is missing so far as I can tell is a ceramic ash dish from one of the desks. He was holding it in his hand when I saw him. What? Oh, where did he go?" Mr. Jasperson paused in his rush of words. "Well, I must have gotten a little dizzy. I was pretty shocked, you know. To be honest, I didn't see where he went. I must have fainted. But I think you can pick him up if you hurry. With that get-up on, he can't get very far away. All right. Thank you, officer." He cradled the phone, pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, and dabbed at his damp forehead. He was a very frightened little man, but he knew he would get over it by morning. End of Viewpoint by Randall Garrett. Recording by Ray Smith, Phoenix, Arizona.